Good morning, everyone. I welcome you to the University of Alcalá and the Shaped Conference, Materials, People, and Written Words in Ancient Cultures. Since 2018, the University of Alcalá has been hosting constant activity in Egyptology with the Middle Kingdom Theban Project, directed by Antonio Morales, the Mortexvar Project, which I direct, and the Medjehu Project under the direction of Gersan. This has been possible thanks to the decided support of the university, particularly to the Vice Directorate for Research and the Department of History and Philosophy, and in collaboration with several colleagues from other schools at the University of Alcalá, architecture, legal medicine, and engineering, among others, and many other colleagues from other institutions worldwide. The Shaped Conference, which will be held in a hybrid format today and tomorrow, will be complemented by the exhibition Beyond the Tree, which will open this evening at the Colegio de Caracholos in this university. And then we'll travel to the University of Lisbon and the Institut Français d'Archéologie Orientale in Cairo. All this activity would have been impossible without the financial and logistic support of the University of Alcalá, the Spanish Ministry for Research, the Castilla-La Mancha region government, the Madrid region government, the European Union, the Medjehu Project, the University of Lisbon, and the IFAO in Cairo. And of course, it would have been impossible without your participation as speakers and attendees here in person or remotely. Thank you very much to you all for being here. And we can start now with what will be an exciting couple of days. I leave the floor to Gersan, the director of the Medjehu Project.
Thank you, Carlos. Thank you, everyone, to be here today. It was a long road to come here, but finally we did it, even if it's so cold, and thank you for everyone to be there. So I will just present briefly the history of this idea of conference, and we'll let you enjoy this first day. For a very, very long time, Egyptology distinguished between text and their supports, considering the former to be a greater interest than the latter. However, by separating text from their supports, a very French specialty in Egyptology, if I may, I'm French. The very essence of Egyptian civilization has been undermined. The ancient Egyptians conceived of their inscribed productions as a whole, whether it was a papyrus, a coffin, or a stela. The material used, the support for the text, being an essential part of the finished object. So it was with this in mind that I suggested to my colleague Carlos Gracia Zamacona, who specialized in coffin text, and I in wood, the medium on which these religious texts are inscribed, that we organized in symposium to reconnect text and materiality. Our discussions enable us to go further than the initial idea behind the symposium, leading us to bring together specialists from different cultural fields to highlight the commonalities that may exist in the way we approach text and material culture, but also to underline the specificities of each of these cultures in order to encourage exchanges and discussions. We have therefore divided these 2 intense days around 3 themes: taking shape, which brings together various themes such as how text becomes materials, how text speaks of material, and how material culture embodies text. The second panel, entitled In Motion, will look at issues related to the identification of productions and workshops, the management of materials between supply and imitation, the mobility of craftsmen, and the evolution of concepts over time. Finally, the last panel, entitled Networks and Transmission, will look at the social network linked to the textual and material production, making it possible to establish links not only between objects, but also between people, thanks to the combined analysis of textual and material sources. Carlos and I would like to thank you for agreeing to present your research and for traveling sometimes from very far away to be here with us. These 2 days will be intense, but I'm sure they will be exciting and rewarding. We'll do our best to keep you awake with coffee breaks and lunches on both days. These 2 breaks will be only reserved for the speakers, as unfortunately the space is not large enough to accommodate all the participants. You can, of course, decide also to have lunch outside of the university, and we will all meet up afterwards. Finally, we'll have the pleasure of meeting again this evening for the opening of the Beyond the Tree exhibition, and tomorrow for a woodworking demonstration presented by Jeffrey Killen, to whom I'd like to extend my warmest thanks. If you have any question, don't hesitate to come and see us. We'll do our best to help. And before giving the floor to Leah Machia for this first session, I would like to thank Carlos most warmly for his friendship, his patience, his help, and his always positive approach to the many unforeseen events that have marked the organization of this conference. This conference ends my 3 years of research at the University of Alcalá. So thank you also to all the team of the university, to Antonio Morales, who will come later, and to all those who have helped us to prepare these 2 days and the exhibition that I hope you will enjoy seeing tonight, and everywhere in the world it will go. Now let me introduce Leah Machia, who will chair the first session of our conference. Leah Machia is a postdoctoral researcher in Egyptology and Coptology at the Cluster of Excellency Understanding Written Artifacts at the Universität Hamburg and at Freie Universität Berlin. She is an archaeologist and epigraphist member of the mission of the University of Barcelona, working at the archaeological site of Oxyrhynchus in Egypt and of the mission of the University of Urbino, investigating the ancient Cyrene in Libya. She specialized in the study of written artifacts associated with religion, mortuary practices, and magic in Greco-Roman and late antique Egypt. I wish you all a wonderful conference. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gigi, for this kind of introduction, and thank you also to Carlos for inviting me to participate at the conference. And of course, welcome to everyone from my side for this first day of the Shaped Conference. Let's start with this first panel. Beyond the seemingly simple fact of putting a text into a medium-text relations are by no means simple, and their complexity requires broader and deeper conceptual and empirical approaches. The complexity of the medium-text relationship is especially true in the case of figurative writings, which maintain a more or less immediate link with the material world. In today's panel, we'll explore and observe this complex phenomenon from a cross-cultural and interdisciplinary perspective, focusing, yes, predominantly on ancient Egypt, but also discussing case studies devoted to ancient Western Asia and Mesoamerica. I would like to introduce our first speaker, Leah Sartini. And good morning. And while she's preparing her for the presentation and her PowerPoint, let me say some words on her background and her work. So Leah Sartini obtained her PhD in Egyptology, University of Pisa in 2021, under the supervision of Professor Marilina Betro. And she specializes in the study of New Kingdom wooden coffins, in particular the so-called black coffins with yellow decoration. For her master's and doctoral thesis, she undertook a comprehensive analysis of this type of coffin, including investigation of the decoration, construction, and the social context of the coffin owners. She's currently a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Alcalá de Henares in the framework of the project Mortexvar, and she collaborates with various international archaeological missions in Egypt, such as Deir el-Medina Institut Français and Royal Necropolis of the Western Wadis. So, saying these few words, I leave the floor to you, and welcome again.
Thank you.
Just should we remember, so you have all the speakers 20 minutes for the speech, and then the discussion is taking place later.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and good morning, everyone. And I want to thank the organizer of this wonderful conference and for letting me be here. Sorry. And today I will present some results of my PhD thesis that I did on this peculiar type of coffins, namely the black coffins with yellow decoration of the New Kingdom. I carried out comprehensive studies on this type of object. I cataloged more than 100 objects, so I led a comprehensive investigation on many aspects, including funerary inscription. Okay, before starting to talk about the inscriptions I cataloged and studied on black coffins, I want to make a very brief outlook on black coffins, just to give you a context. Generally speaking, they appear in the joint reign of Hatshepsut Moses III and disappear around the first half of the 20th dynasty, even if the period in which they were most common is the 18th dynasty. Most of the examples come from the necropolis of Thebes, which was the epicenter of production, but there are some examples from other necropolises throughout Egypt. From Saqqara to Tombos, thus they spread over most of the Egyptian territory. It's okay. And were probably produced in different areas. The geographical spread of black coffins was also due to their extensive use within the Egyptian society. They were used for men, women, children belonging to different social classes, so from the royal family to the middle class, with clear differences in quality. In fact, we can find expensive sets of multiple coffins with a large amount of gold leaf used for the decoration, and coffin produced in series, on which the name of the owner was sometimes, not always, added at a later time after purchase. However, what all these coffins have in common is the iconographic and textual program, despite some differences in quality and some variation, as we will see below. Indeed, the purpose of these coffins is both to reproduce the perfect eternal image of the deceased and to provide him with magical protection, to create for him a sacred environment in which he can rebirth. It follows that the coffin is treated as a wall with the decoration continuous on leaden box, so with vertical and horizontal inscribed bands dividing the surface into panels decorated with several gods, images taken by funerary books, and magical symbols. Thus, on the lid, associated with the celestial sphere, we find a winged goddess, such as the vulture Nekhbet or the goddess Nut, while on the box, associated instead with the tomb of Osiris in the underworld, we find a series of different gods, namely Anubis and the four sons of Horus on the sides, Nephthys at the head end, and Isis at the foot end, all of them with their respective utterances, as occurs in the chapter 151 of the Book of the Dead, the literary source from which this subject comes. Sometimes Anubis and the sons of Horus on the box are framed by the figure of a god Thoth, cutting an opening in the sky with a rod, who comes instead from the chapter 161 of the Book of the Dead. Other iconographic motifs can be found on the side of a box, such as the Ujadais or the god Anubis as a jackal on a shrine, but Anubis as a human with jackal's head and two sons of Horus are always present on each side. In this context, the funerary formulae inscribed on the coffins are an extension of this iconographic program. They are always inscribed according to the same layout, and most importantly, they are always associated with a specific part of a coffin and its decoration, as we will see below. In fact, in the following slide, I will not carry out a philological analysis of a formulae, but I will only give an overview of their type, their meaning, showing the most common standard composition in which they were copied on the coffin, on which part of the coffin they were copied, highlighted some of their chronological, social, and geographic peculiarities. Thus, in the center of the lid, and only here, we can find a prayer addressed to the goddess Nut, asking her to protect the deceased and to place him among the imperishable stars, living within her, thus placing him in a cosmological position. With standard text, I mean the most complete version of the text that I have been able to reconstruct by comparing the evidence found on different coffins. A variant of the prayer of Nut is found only on one coffin dated to the early stages of the development of black coffins, when their decorative and textual program was not fully standardized. However, the Nut prayer can be replaced by the Heteplinezut formula, which can also appear in the side bands on the lid, but this is happened just on a few coffins, on a very few coffins. It is not related to the decoration, and all the formulae that I catalogued different from each other. The peculiarity is that almost all the coffins with this formula belong to the elite of the society, and they are dated before the end of the reign of Menhotep III. It is therefore possible that, at least at the beginning, the formula was seen as a status symbol, linked to the tradition to the past, as it was used on coffin of a second intermediate period and early New Kingdom. Almost all the time, on the two side bands of the lid, we find two utterances of the god Geb and Nut, both affirming the legitimacy of the deceased to receive a favorable judgment from the divine court as justified, just as Osiris was justified after a dispute with his brother Set over the kingship. As for the utterance of Nut, it is almost always found in the L2, I don't know if you can read it, L2 and L1 sidebands, and only on a very few specimens in L1, or at the head end. It always appears in the standard form, except on two coffins belonging to two members of a very high society. As we will see below, the coffins belonging to members of elite show more freedom in the composition of the texts compared to the standard form. The utterance of Geb, on the other hand, is always found on the L2 sideband, without exceptions. It appears almost always in its standard form, with two only exceptions. On a coffin of a member of a royal family, so more freedom in the composition, as we said, and on a coffin from a peripheral necropolis. So probably this coffin was not produced in Thebes. The formula Himakier or Jedmedwen Himakier, namely honored by or was spoken by the honored by a specific god, appears on all the coffin analyzed, always in the transverse band starting from the lid and ending to the box, so from T1 to T8. While the first three bands on each side of the box, namely T1, 2, 3, and T5, 6, 7, show an inscription associated, of course, with the god depicted on the box at their side, so the sons of Horus and Anubis, the inscription written in the last two bands, so T4 and T8, are not so closely related to the decoration, but they still have the purpose of reinforcing the identification of a deceased with Osiris. Thus, some relatives of this god are named in the inscription, such as Geb, Nut, Shu, or Horus. However, other gods may also be mentioned, such as Thoth, when is depicted on the coffin, or the falcon goddess Dunanui, while a few coffins show a peculiar formula that mention the crowns of Upper and Lower Egypt. Next to the gods depicted on the box are their respective utterances. In fact, these formulae all began with words spoken by the depicted god. Anubis is the only one who is depicted on both sides of a box, and is therefore distinguished by two different epithets, namely Imihut, responsible for embalming on one side, and Hentisenecher, he who precedes over the divine tent on the other side. And he is accompanied by two different formulae, always related to his role as protector of the intact body of a deceased. Instead, each of the four sons of Horus, two on each side of a box, is generally associated with one type of formula. Although there are some exceptions, we generally find in Seti and Duamotev on the right side of the box, at the shoulder and foot respectively, and Hapi and Quebec-Samuel on the left side. Although the texts associated with the four gods differ in composition, their context is very similar. The four gods claim to protect, save from enemies, and keep the body of a deceased intact. Since these formulae all begin with the words Janmeduin, different scholars have hypothesized that these descriptions are the perpetual reproduction of a real funerary ritual, and that therefore these gods were not only passive protectors of a deceased, identified as Osiris, but had an active role in the process of preparing his body for the afterlife. Mostly from the reign of Amenhotep III, a figure of Thoth starts to appear at the four corners of the box, together with four different formulae, indicated here as A, B, C, D. These four figures of Thoth are associated with the four cardinal points where the god makes openings in the sky with a rod. These openings allowed the wind to reach the earth and bring breath to the deceased, but also allowed the rising sun to ascend into the sky, a journey that the sun could make with the transfigured deceased. And it is to this solar theology that the Thoth inscription actually refers. The four quite cryptic inscriptions, all beginning with "Ray lives, the turtle dies," tell us how the living sun emerges unhurt from the conflict he had with his enemy Apophis, condemned in the form of a turtle, during his celestial journey. Finally, the goddesses Nephthys at the head end and Isis at the foot end can also be flanked by two specific utterances, in which they declare that they protect the body of the deceased, that the two goddesses were also responsible for his transformation into Osiris, since their inscription mentioned that the bandages will be removed, his face will be illuminated, and his eyes will be opened forever. It is noteworthy that almost all the coffins depicting Isis and her utterance at the foot end are dated around the reign of Amenhotep III, with just a very few examples dated later. So, as already mentioned, there are usually differences in inscription on the coffins between high-quality coffins and the coffins produced in series. While the former provide a more accurate and complete version of the formulae, sometimes showing more freedom in their composition compared to the standard form, the latter generally reproduce them in abbreviated form. Indeed, the length and quality of the text on a coffin also influenced the final cost of the object. However, even good quality coffins sometimes show the formulae in a short form. Although sometimes on coffin of very, very poor quality, the texts are cut so badly that they are incomprehensible, meaning that the formulae were simply copied on the coffins without any knowledge of their meaning. In most cases, especially from the reign of Amenhotep III, the texts are cut in recurring patterns, which may reflect the tradition of different workshops. For example, the prayer and the utterance of Nut on the lid, when they appear in the short version, are just cut out of the last sentence, while the utterance of Geb is always cut out of the last two sentences. Instead, the utterances of the Sons of Horus on the side of the box show more than one short version. So IMSETI utterance presents three standard cuts. It can be cut out of the last sentence, the penultimate sentence, or the incipit, in which the god presents himself as the son of his deceased. The utterance of Duamutef can be cut out of the last sentence, the last two sentences, or the last three sentences. The utterance of Api can be cut out of the penultimate sentence or the last two sentences. Quebec-Samuel's utterance can be cut out of the last sentence, the last two sentences, or the last three sentences. Conversely, very high quality coffin, in addition to usually presenting the formula in their correct full standard version, can also present unique descriptions that do not appear on other back coffins. For example, the outer coffin of Tuya, the mother-in-law of Amenhotep III, have two inscriptions referring to the beautiful west and to the western desert, while the coffin of a daughter of Tutankhamun presents two identical inscriptions referring to Osiris, Prince of Eternity, great in Abydos. Remarkably, some black coffins from Tell el Amarna are an exception to the previous description, as they do not show the traditional decorative scheme with Anubis, Thoth, and the sons of Horus, but figures of priests, mourners, or relatives of a deceased making offerings. It is noteworthy that this new decorative scheme has also been found on 3 coffins from 2 other necropolises, such as Del Medina and Acoris. We don't know whether if they were made in Amarna and moved or not, we don't know. However, although even if the content of the inscription on these coffins change, of course, naming Aten, the deceased and his relatives, or reporting peculiar formula in which the deceased asked for food, wine, and the breath of the north wind, the layout does not change, and the incipit Imahiher is still used in the crossband. Regarding the decorative techniques used for the text, we can observe a chronological peculiarity when the texts were not simply painted in yellow, but gold leaf was used. In fact, a period of experimentation preceded the use of a canonical technique, namely in relief on plaster, which became the standard solution from the reign of Amenhotep III onwards. In fact, on the coffin of Merit, the texts are engraved. On that of Atnefer, they are painted in black directly on gold leaf, while on the outer sarcophagus of Mayerpri, exceptionally in the shape of a shrine, the hieroglyphs are cut one by one in the gold leaf and applied on the surface of the coffin. So, to sum up, we have seen that funerary formulae inscribed on black coffins are always linked to a specific part of the object and represent an extension on their iconographic program. They may show chronological peculiarities. In fact, some formulae were mainly used during specific periods, while the standard short forms of the texts seem to have appeared during the reign of Amenhotep III. So when the black coffins probably reached their maximum popularity. In fact, non-traditional decorative techniques for gilded description were only used until the reign of his pharaoh, a period when both text and decorative techniques were less standardized. Regarding social differences, the case of low-quality coffins produced in series and then used for women is indicative. In fact, the inscriptions do not present feminine pronouns and adjectives, but masculine ones. So the texts were not adapted to the female owner, and their name was just only added later, after purchase. Lastly, even if the epicenter of production of black coffin was Thebes, it is very likely that there were other centers of production. Indeed, we have seen that sometimes a peculiar variant of a formula only occurs on a coffin from a peripheral necropolis. However, the data available so far is not enough to identify this other center of production, with the exception maybe of Tell el Amarna, where black coffins with non-traditional decoration and funerary texts were produced. However, hopefully, new data will come in the future. Thank you. I finished. Thank you. Thank you.
So, I would like now to introduce our user next speaker. Welcome. We trained. Yes, I think. Yeah. Muy bien. So Pinar is an art historically trained archaeologist with a strong background in anthropology and museums. She is currently associate curator and department head at the Morgan Library and Museum. And she has a wide research interest ranging from ancient Western Asia, ancient Anatolia, history of death and burial, mortuary archaeology, image and identity making in Mesopotamian Anatolia, to digital museums, museum ethics, and archaeological copies and reproductions. She received her PhD from Brown University and has been teaching for over a decade in universities, museums, and school classrooms about archaeology and the ancient world. Her teaching, her education approach is also reflected in her recently published monograph, An Educator's Handbook for Teaching About the Ancient World. And so now I will leave you the floor and
Thank you, Leah, for chairing this session, and thank you, Gigi and Carlos, for organizing this exciting conference. I don't know where to put this, but maybe here is the best. Okay, so today I'm going to be talking about copies. So I'll share with you my outline. So the general idea that I'm going to try to share with you is how can we present and exhibit copies better? And by copies here, I mean modern copies. But I'm also going to talk a little bit about the practice of copying in ancient Western Asia, in the ancient context itself. And as an object that has text, image, and material, I'm going to bring in cylinder seals as my case study. And then hopefully in the discussion, we can all discuss what this materiality means in terms of thinking about the objects or learning more about the ancient objects. This research on copies started when I was working at the Vorderasiatisches Museum in Berlin. As you know, it's now closed for 14 years, so it will be a while until we go back and see these objects. But I provided this image which shows how many copies there are on display to create this kind of historical narrative of ancient Western Asia. So you see the reconstruction of the Ishtar Gate's first phase, the second phase. There's a copy of a statue that you can see in the background. I don't know if I can show here. Oh, you can see it. But anyways, in the background, there's a statue of Puzur Ishtar, whose head, the original head is in Berlin, the body is in Istanbul, and both museums have a full reconstructed copy of the statue. And in the foreground, you can see the stele of Hammurabi, the Codex of Hammurabi. And that brings me to my point about the interconnection between text, image, and material. So there are many copies of the Codex of Hammurabi all across the world. I brought some examples here. There's even a copy in the UN building, in the United Nations building in New York, as one of the earliest law codes, which has an historical importance. And all of these copies were made by the Louvre, where the original is now standing, and because they have their own plaster workshops. So in the early years of the discovery of these ancient Western Asian sites, when an important monument or object was discovered, the plaster workshops of the museums would create a copy and then distribute it or sell it to other museums, because the idea was you represent the whole history of ancient Near East in your museum. So if you don't have the Codex of Hammurabi, how are you going to talk about, you know, the old Babylonian period? So that's how most of these copies ended up in museums. And today, since we have also the ability and technology to create 3D copies, a lot of museums are creating either digital or even 3D printed copies. And a good example of this is the Hammurabi Stele at the Museum of Ancient Near East in Boston. And this is their a screenshot from their Sketchfab. You can see 211 people downloaded this, so they probably printed it somewhere on their 3D printers. And again, the idea with having these copies is not only to document the object, but also to enable more people, students, researchers to have access to the text. As you all know, it's probably more not easier, but more authentic to be able to read a text from its original surface and object. So I was thinking about, this interrelationship between the object itself, its copy, and the text on it. And there's one interesting example in Berlin, which are these two lamassus. They are both copies. And instead of standing like this, they're kind of standing like that. And that is because the museum was built without having these objects. The objects were integrated later. But the copies, especially the copy on the left side, this one was bought from the British Museum excavations when these were excavated in Nimrod. So a copy arrived from the British to Berlin before even this museum was open to the public. And you can see, so this is the copy of this one in the British Museum. And you can see this VAG 25 has an inscription. But as lamassus are usually, they come in pairs. When one copy arrived to Berlin, they were like, well, we need another one for the other side. So they made a copy of the copy, but you can see the copy of the copy doesn't have an inscription, because if you mirror it, the inscription wouldn't make sense. So it's empty, it's left empty. So even though there's this close connection between the object and the text, and this was, done about 100 years ago, even today when we do these digital reconstructions, sometimes we separate the text, the image, and the surface or the material itself. So I'm showing you here a color reconstruction of one of the Assyrian reliefs. So this was a recent exhibit before the museum closed called Filtered Time. And it's a projection, it's a color projection onto the Assyrian reliefs. But normally, Assyrian reliefs not only had color, but they also had an inscription on it. But the inscription was not reconstructed. So this brings me to the question, when we copy things, when do we copy the image and when do we copy the text? And thinking about this question made me look into the actual ancient context of copying in ancient Western Asia, because I feel in the museum sometimes we put together all the copies as as one context. So if we have Roman copies or Mesopotamian copies, we all talk about them as one type of object. But I argue that it's probably better and more authentic to think about the original ancient context of that culture where these copies are being made from. In an ancient Mesopotamia or ancient Western Asia, copying is a very essential practice. You learn by copying. We have all these homework tablets or school tablets where on one side, the teacher would write, and on the other side, the student would copy the text. And if you look into, I'm not an Assyriologist, so I got these from an Assyriologist colleague and friend, but even the words that are used for writing can also mean to copy, because there's not that big of a differentiation between, okay, I'm writing an original text versus I am copying a text that exists already. And this is how knowledge gets preserved in ancient Western Asia. The reason why we have all these important texts, for example, the Epic of Gilgamesh, is because these texts were being copied and the copies were being kept in libraries. Here I'm bringing an example from the Morgan Library and Museum. This is a copy of the Epic of Atrahasis, which mentions one of the earliest versions of the flood story. People get really excited when they see this on display in the museum. But the tablet itself mentions that this was copied by a junior scribe. And again, the value of the object itself doesn't diminish just because it was copied. And some of these copies, of course, were probably direct copies, but some of them were also edits or different versions. So in some cases, the text would have commentary, they would have some interpretations, some additions, some exclusions. So the texts themselves are copies, but in some ways they are also new objects in their own right. And early scholars of the field of Assyriology adapted this practice of copying by bringing together different kinds of copies of the same text to create a more complete text. And that's how we have the translation. Sometimes a word is missing in this text and you bring it from another one and you bring it together, and that's the copy. But it's also in some ways a new object. And I like this picture because this is a clay tablet that was created by a scholar by bringing together several different original fragments of writing. And that brings me to the question, is text and image inseparable? If copying the text is integral, should we also adapt that in our understanding of modern copies? And to answer this question, I look at now cylinder seals, because the Morgan collection consists mostly of cylinder seals. We have about 2,000 seals that were collected by a scholar who went to the Babylonian expedition, and then the collection basically was with him. It was displayed at the Metropolitan Museum of Art for a while, and then it was acquired by J.P. Morgan for his private collection. And most of the objects from that collection were given to the Yale Babylonian collection. So now a lot of the tablets from that collection are there because there is a department of Assyriology there. But the collection that I'm in charge of has still about 2,000 seals and a couple of tablets. So if anyone ever comes to New York, please come and visit. We can look at the seals together. So this collection was published by a famous seal scholar, Edith Porada, who actually escaped Nazi Germany. So she has a very interesting life story. But what she did in publishing these seals, and this is very common in the early seal studies, not just in Mesopotamia, but I assume also for ancient Egypt, is that the image is published in the place by itself without the object. Sometimes you see drawings, illustrations, again, without any kind of reference to the material surface. So you have no idea, is this a lapis seal? Is this a Fritz seal? So the material and the surface is completely separated from its image. Today on display at the Morgan, how we display the seals is that we have the seal itself, we have a small gray clay impression of it, and an enlarged and zoomed in photograph of that impression. So the idea is that you kind of start from the bigger image and you kind of zoom in into the material. And the inscriptions as well are mentioned in the title of the artwork or in the title of the cylinder seal, which was not the case in the early publications because the inscription was almost secondary, or the inscription would be studied by an Assyriologist who can read the text, and then the image would be studied by an art historian, which completely defeats the point of cylinder seals since material and text are so closely interconnected. And I'm sure some of you are aware of this. The cylinder seals kind of go hand in hand of the cuneiform technology. So here I just put a very short introduction to how these images that we see in the early seals come from these early tokens that were used as writing devices or documentation. So if you're sending some sort of material or good to somebody else, it would be represented as a token. And later on, these tokens basically became the symbols of that good or of that material on clay tablets, which later then became the cuneiform sign. So again, there are studies that mention this. There are early studies, there are later studies, but there's a very recent one that now is tracing more systematically what these images on the seals are and what kind of proto-cuneiform sign they turn into. So if you're interested, that is the reference for that study. In addition to this, even in the early years of the study of the cylinder seals, scholars noticed this very complicated connection between how the material of or how the object itself was created and how it's connected to these different kinds of technologies. Cuneiform technology is one of them, but also the shape of the object itself, because it is a cylinder stone, it's connected to bead making and engraving. The materials are connected to cultural context of trading or local and non-local production techniques or materials. So separating all of these elements from each other will ignore all these things that are kind of interconnected. Again, going back to this question of, is text and image inseparable? If we look at how ancient Mesopotamians themselves thought of this idea, is that I bring here a seal that was recarved. So this is a Babylonian seal that was later on recarved in the Kassite period. So you can see basically the old Babylonian design is marked in green, and the blue is the Kassite edition. And before the Kassite edition was made, normally there would have been a text in between those two female figures, and that was kind of chipped out. So if you just publish the text of the seal, you're missing all this different kind of information. So now that we placed copying text and images in ancient Western Asia, I want to turn to how we copy these seals today, because in addition to 2,000 actual seals, I have about 4,000 impressions and documents and everything that goes with the seals, which I also have to organize. So I looked at different kinds of materials and ways of copying these seals. So in the Földi Asiatisches Museum, for example, there are copies that are in plaster, which is easy, cheap. They break very easily, so they're not very long-term solutions. Some of them are on wax. So just like we do today, there are wax seal impressions, and then damp clay, which is good because it's close to the original material, but it also breaks very easily. And if you hold it a little bit too tight, your fingerprint gets on it, so it's not a good material. In the Morgan Library and Museum, we similarly have these greenish oily clay that were made at some point. So we have impressions of the collection that's in the Morgan, but we also have impressions of other museum collections. So in the early days when we didn't have all these online collections databases, people would go to another collection, make their own impression and bring the impression back instead of making a photograph, because then you have the material copy of the images. So today I have to organize them. It's a current project, so that's why I'm kind of complaining about it. So all these things sit in our collections. I don't know if any of you use them. Nobody ever requested seal impressions from the collection, but we have a record of them. So if something happens to the original, there are impressions of the seals that are across museums in the world. Again, now we have the technology to 3D print them. So this I found in the office, which is a larger 3D printed copy of a seal that depicts the earlier depiction of a cyclops. But the original seal is this big. So in terms of understanding the object itself, I am skeptical that 3D printing something on a completely different scale will help us understand the object itself. But I recognize that it is important for educational purposes. For example, our docents use some of these in their tours in the galleries, or understanding certain details that we may not be able to see on the smaller surface. Another thing that I find useful in displaying and creating copies is how they're actually used. Because in the ancient world, they were not making these tiny, neat little, almost like tiny paintings on gray clay. So I think it's useful to show the actual sealing. So we have a bunch of them in the collection you can see on the left. And I showed also here how the Penn Museum shows them. So there's a sealing, and they explain where the sealing would fit in terms of sealing a basket or sealing a document or sealing a jar mouth. And I think often these things don't get put on display. So if you go to the Louvre, you will see very few ceilings. At the Morgan, there are no ceilings on display. I think because they kind of look like this. They're kind of like lumps of clay. And maybe the difference is because art museums display objects that are usually complete, prettier, than the ceilings. But if you go to anthropology and archaeology museums, the idea is that you're supposed to be understanding the context of the objects. So I think there could be something in between where we talk about the original materials and also the object and how these two things interact. So one way to do this very easily could be, instead of using gray clay, maybe a terracotta colored clay, for example. And the other solution that I found to this is to make the seals yourself. So when people or groups or classrooms come to the museum, we look at the seals first, and then we go to the education room and actually make them. So just working with stone, with different kinds of stones. Usually we work with steatite, which is also an ancient material that was used for cylinder seals, or harder stones like lapis, which is almost impossible to carve for students. Just working with the materials and understanding how these things were created adds another layer of understanding, and students start asking different questions, which can lead or leads to different research questions again. So I'm still working on copies and trying to find the best ways to make them useful. For example, the seal impressions I told you, I don't know if they are at this point not useful anymore, since we have digital photographs, since we have 3D models. So I'm trying to figure out what is the best way to use them. But the main takeaways from the research that's going on around the copies is that because text, image, and material are so closely connected, I think we can use these kinds of entanglements as models to present, display, and teach about the ancient world. Instead of focusing on one aspect, kind of doing a more comprehensive understanding of the object will also allow us to think about the people who are creating these instead of just focusing on the object. And that's, I think, one thing that museums are moving towards, is this more people-centered narratives, instead of we have to have everything from ancient Near East, from the Codex of Hammurabi to the Lamassu. It's talking about the stories or the production, the skills of the workmen and the craftsmen. And instead of taking these copies out of their context, we can, again, by talking about these like materials, productions, texts, and images, we can put them in their cultural context. I think, and maybe some of you will disagree, and I'm happy to discuss this, digital scans or plastic 3D printed replicas, I think, are very useful for documentation, but they do not often raise new questions about the object itself. So if you have the capacity to do a 3D print, I think it's useful to ask, can we make this with our own hands? Can we bring a craftsman to make these things instead of just copying it with a 3D printer? And I'm happy to hear what you think about that. And again, I think this would allow us to interact with the physical materiality of the objects, and we can ask more important questions about the past. So I end it there, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you. I would like to introduce our next speaker, Gael. And he is currently a PhD candidate in École in Paris under the supervision of Andreas Staude. And he is currently investigated as part of his doctorate thesis in Egyptian lexicon of
Will it work? Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Okay. Good morning, everyone. I'm going to actually apologize at first because I forgot in the text that actually I discovered the first time I discovered this papyrus with was at the atelier of IFAO. And so I was really drawn to this papyrus that I'm going to show you soon because it was a bit tricky to understand. The papyrus is being, it will be published soon for the BNF, Bibliothèque Nationale de France. And it has been not studied before, but it was restored recently. So I'm going to show you briefly what some features are. It is possibly from the 21st dynasty. From Theban area, as we saw before with coffin as well. And it has a description of the Amduat, so the funerary text known from the Hatshepsut, at least from the Hatshepsut reign, and is actually like a travelogue, like a Google map for the deceased, the soul, the Ba, and to show the Ba how to deal with the journey, because there are enemies, there are gods, there are helpers. So it has to know the formulas, and it has to know how to proceed during this voyage. And here we can see actually that the first part of the on the right, I'm sorry, it has really like some kind of standard features for the time, but it has some marks that still we don't know what they're being made by. Maybe some artificial kind of making. The material standards are kind of standard for the papyrus, so it's really common for the time. So this is kind of reassuring, because the thing that is not really clear is that we have two parts. We have the first part here is the abbreviated version of the Amduat, and the other part here is the 12th hour, actually the last part. It's been really kind of intriguing, the fact that they put them together. And maybe the reason why is because the two parts represents a link between the Ba, the soul, and the Sulca Osiris as the body, the corpse of the deceased that is on the extreme part. It could be actually like even some connection, we can notice some connection with the architecture, because these 2 hours in tombs, like for example, in New Kingdom, are really like opposite to each other. So in this papyrus, this dimension of opposite, upside down, is really kind of evident. Here, I'm going to briefly describe the story, but maybe some of you already know, so I'm going to be really quick about it. We have only one register, and in the register, there's the solar port here, and with the ram's head. And you know that during this last part of the travel, of the voyage, actually, the solar boat is kind of told by the gods, the 7 the gods here, but is going to enter the body of the snake, and from the tail to the mouth. So it's going to get it upside down in a way, and it's still interesting to notice that when he goes out, the last part, he becomes Capri, the regenerated aspect of the solar disk, and he gets out through the arms of Shu. Okay, so what is really important, and it was really intriguing, in that we could identify some part of the text, but only here, so the 4th abbreviated hour, and here, which is the last part of the middle register of the 12th hour, which is the last. What is intriguing is that the other part of the papyrus is completely obscure, or at least we can find names like God's names or snake names, but it's not really the part what we expect to be here. I'm going to show you a few examples. For example, there is a title that is really important in this part because it's the name of the Mehento, is the snake, is the encircler. The meaning is encircler of the world. And usually this part should be after, right after the part that we identified, but actually it's really at the opposite part, actually. So then here I'm going to like the text reconstructed. And what is really interesting is also that the text is in retrograde writing. So it's the opposite of the common left to right. So is right to left. And also is from the bottom to the top by segments. So I'm actually more into lexicography. So I started to analyze the text. The text is kind of standard in a way, but what is really interesting is that it is upside down. On the second part, on my right, we can identify so the name of the gods and some other parts of the text as name of the divinities, of helpers, and but there's some really peculiar thing as well, that here we are at the end of the journey. So we are facing the east. The sun rebirth. But actually, here is mentioned the west, which should not be here, actually. So these are west, man. I'm going to show you why later, maybe this is possible. And the snake, you can see the name also is the life of the gods. So again, dealing with rebirth and rejuvenation. So these are the parts that we could identify, even if they're not connected to each other, and there's not really a real sentence made with them. The reason why of this illegibility could be because it's actually, as we said before, is made probably because it has to be a magical, symbolic meaning behind the hieroglyphics, so writing. I think here we have this very interesting relationship between the medium and the text. The copy as well that we could find of similar parallels shows that maybe it was there like a kind of pattern that was used and was known by the same, probably the same workshop. The retrograde writing served, as ritual purpose, so it was usually found in funerary texts. But the unconventional direction here, it kind of mirrors the beliefs of their tradition, of the afterlife journey, actually. So I'm not going to really focus on the meaning of the retrograde writing. I'm going to just point that maybe it mirrors the solar cycle as well, the sun death, and then in the west, right, and the rebirth in the east, the left part. It adds, I think, a layer of meaning, complexity, and symbolic to the text, to the very text, and it reflects the interplay with text, medium, material, and image, giving even a more intense meaning for the text. I think in this papyrus is really important because the first thing is that the reversed writing direction takes shapes in a way that mirrors and enacts the inversion that is in the amduat, in the nether world, in the afterlife world. And this inversion and reversal of the journey is there in the writing and in this obscure kind of writing. Okay. A second point is that I think this retrograde writing it mirrors as well the solar cycle, as I said before, and the seed's own transformative journey through the afterlife. It sets like the motion of the thing through its very form. So it's really something active as a performance as well. The third point, I think that here it becomes like a trace of these networks, the networks that we're going to explore soon between not only this papyrus, but other parallels that we've found, because actually maybe it was a distinctive kind of marker that links this papyrus with other parallels that we found. I'm going to show you which one I could. The first parallel is actually a bit odd because it's a Book of the Dead papyrus, but he has the Unduad in it. So it is a book, but with other kind of illustration, which is kind of peculiar, especially at this time. And it could be dated to the 21st dynasty because of paleography, but I'm not gonna be really reassured only by that, because it could be even later. But we can notice that there are some similarities, very strong similarities in the boat and the sun, and the way it's shaped is really, really kind of peculiar and similar. The second parallel, I'm sorry. The second parallel is the Unduad. It is really the 11th and the 12th hours of the Unduad, but as you can see, is in Turin. This one shows the same kind of representation of the Capri god and Osiris with the arms of Shu at the end of the journey. The third is in Cortona as well in Italy. And I found that there are some similarities in the same kind of thing twice this time, the solar boat and the Capri god and Osiris. This is not really common actually. So that's why it was really rare to find this parallels. The thing that really is in common is not only the fact that the images and the iconography is similar, but is that the text as well is kind of obscure. In this three papyrus at least, we cannot understand the text. The first one was the Book of the Dead, so no problem with that, just parallels with images. Here, the text is also obscure. We can understand words, but it's not a complete sentence. So it's like the second part, the first part on the left of our papyrus of the BNF, which raises kind of interesting questions about maybe they're all likely from the Theban area. So we saw before we have other kind of material from this maybe composition. And the owner of some of them are unknown, but there is kind of a trend at this period, especially for the Unduad papyri, to be in burials with the elite. So I compared the materiality, and they actually pretty similar in that. They all have 4 or 3 sheets, and the columns are pretty kind of 36, 41 per hour. And the similar dimension, as I showed before, are kind of standards for the time. color scheme and composition across all the three. They kind of suggest a standardization production practices during this time, especially from the same workshop. There are minor variations, but they might reflect individual scribble hands or specific commission requirements, but they all kind of show that the atelier, the workshop could be pretty much the same. I told you that the similar iconography, especially for solar bark, deities, serpents, and Osiris, and he suggests a visual repertoire, a common visual repertoire, maybe with room for customization to respect and emphasize the local traditions. Yeah. At this part, I think it's good to find or to propose a link between the retrograde writing and the asemantic portions. I'm not using asemic because the meaning of asemic, I'm sorry to be very precise, means that there's no meaning. The meaning and the signs are there, but maybe it's like connected to the very text, the Amduat text, and I'm going to show you at the end. They contain both retrograde writing and asemantic portions. The features often appear together in these 21st parallels. They suggest a deliberate, meaningful pairing rather than coincidental damage or variation. And the retrograde writing visually enacts the inversion and reversal that happens in the netherworld. I kind of try to establish some kind of connection with the text, because in a way, this kind of illegible text serve as a symbolic function, and it kind of mirrors the text. So in the second hour of the Amduat, we could find this sentence. And in this sentence, actually, there is Ornung, a very famous specialist for the Amduat. I will follow the translation, but actually I'm going to focus on some words that I think are interesting to highlight. This is done like this image. The image here, which refers to the papyrus, is Seshemu, is connected to the word Shem, that means to move, to go. So it's really something that has to be active in motion with the whole composition. And in the secrecy of the realm of the netherworld, it's really important that I show you before the Imanet is the West. The West means something obscure, it's the same root. And here it's really important that this word is inaccessible, is mysterious, maybe as the writing, as the retrograde kind of portion that I showed you before. And it's something that is not only secret and obscure, but it's also something that is only destined to few people. And it's something that is Secher Ma. Secher Ma means that it's something outstanding. It's like something that you use, is functional to complete the journey and to be reborn again in the afterlife. So I think it's interesting to notice these few things, connection with the text, the material. And the second part is that I found interesting to compare is actually the fact that they have to be like this form, sacred, but only obscure and concealed. And it only has to be revealed only for a few people. An edge means rare. It means that it's not for everyone to know, and only people who knows this text can access to the afterlife, actually. So it enhances the magical efficacy of the text, and only for initiated readers. And it mirrors again what I said before, the two parts that are kind of connected even in the architecture of the tombs where the text was reproduced at first. So to sum it up is that together, a retrograde and a semantic writing create a potent material visual reflection of the liminal space between the death and rejuvenation, order from chaos, the revelation and the concealment that the deceased must navigate through the journey. And also, I think it's really interesting to notice that the meaning and the content are even more subtle after these two parts are combined. Thank you all for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this very okay. Yes, okay. So I don't know if Zsombor Földi is ready with us online.
Yes, he's there.
Yeah, hello. Good morning. So welcome, and just before leaving the floor to you, I'm just saying a few words on your work. So Zsombor Földi is a postdoctoral researcher at the Ludwig-Maximilians-Universität München at the Institute for Archaeologie and Étymologie, and a member of the EBL project, Electronic Babylonian Literature Project. Among his many publications might be cited further fragments of the hymn to the Queen of Nippur, more fragments of the Councils of Wisdom, and prosopography of old Babylonian documents from Larsa on seal impressions, the king's name, and the so-called double filiation, all published in 2023. And now I leave you with the floor. Today's presentation talk is entitled The Electronic Babylonian Literature Project Results and Prospects.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me? Okay, hopefully you can see my slides as well. Yeah. So I will introduce you briefly the Electronic Babylonian Literature Project, mostly its results and a bit of its future prospects. We go back now to Mesopotamia, which is a land that doesn't have a lot of raw materials like stone and timber, but it has lots of clay, for which it was used as a writing material as well. Clay is an excellent writing material. It's extremely durable. It is imperishable as long as it is in the ground, but as soon as you remove it from the ground, either by a scientific excavation or illicit digging, it becomes extremely fragile, which is why my colleagues have been playing this kind of jigsaw puzzles for more than 150 years now. The cuneiform languages, and especially Akkadian, are actually quite large corpora. It is only ancient Greek that has currently more words than ancient Akkadian, including Babylonian and Assyrian, but it is a very dynamically growing corpus. So basically every day new tablets turn up either through scientific excavations or from the antiquities market. In order to tackle all the challenges we have been faced, the EBL project had two large sections at aim. So two large text corpora, the so-called EBL corpus, represents a composition-based approach, and it aimed to provide up-to-date text editions of the most important pieces of Akkadian literature, especially from the first millennium BC. These editions were meant to be fully lemmatized and could be updated with every new fragment. As you all know, who have been working with text editions, as soon as a new text fragment is published, the printed edition becomes obsolete. So it is one of the greatest benefits of an online database. The other large section, the fragmentarium, represents a manuscript-based approach, and it was meant to be a pool of fragments of whatever contents. For practical reason, we began with Ashurbanipal's library in Nineveh because it was already digitized. And between these two corpora, an automated comparison was meant to find new pieces, new manuscripts of the compositions that were already edited in the corpus. For this EBL project, Professor Enrique Jimenez got a Sofia Kovalevskaya Prize from the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation, and this allowed him to fund this project for 6 years. The project, the EBL project, officially ended this summer, but as you will see, there are already other projects building upon its results. First, a couple of words to the corpus. We have divided the approximately 3 dozens of Akkadian literary compositions into groups according to the main genres. So narrative poetry, you may know the poem of creation, also known as Enuma Elish, or the poem of Gilgamesh, and maybe some others as well. The monologue and dialogue literature, including most of what we call wisdom literature. And in the third category, the hymns of prayers to various gods and goddesses. Those that are set in bold type are already available online. Others are still in the making. Each corpus edition, here you can see the very beginning of the poem of creation, Enuma Elish. Each corpus edition contains line by line an ideal grammatically solid reconstruction of the Akkadian text in transcription, and then a score transliteration of how this line is actually preserved in the individual manuscripts from different places, from different periods. Each corpus edition contains at least an English translation, some of them Arabic translations as well, and are fully lemmatized. Fully lemmatized means we have among our tools an Akkadian dictionary, which is mostly based on the Concise Dictionary of Akkadian, so an already published Dictionary of Akkadian, but it is also complemented with other features like Arabic translations, which are especially useful for our Iraqi colleagues. And then on the right, if you see this blue panel in the corpus, you can switch on and switch off all the features you need for your purpose or you are interested in. That is a score transliteration, former line numbering. So for instance, if there was a print edition that has been very influential, but we were able, by finding new fragments, we were able to close gaps. We had to renumber certain sections of the text. So the line numbering changed, but in order to use the earlier literature, you may also be aware of the previous line numbering. Then the meter, and most recently, you cannot even see it on this slide, phonetic transcription. So if you have no idea of Akkadian, but you want to know how to pronounce it, it is possible now. You can also download these editions as an ATF file, as a JSON file, and also more recently in Word format. We consider these online editions online publications, which is why we have registered them. We have registered DOIs for them, so it is more, it is easier to cite them. Some of our colleagues already do that, but at the same time, we also know that some of our colleagues still stick to print publications, which is why we established a series of articles at the Assyriological journal Kaskal, and we have been publishing our most spectacular findings. In 5 years, we published almost 50 short articles in slightly less than 400 pages. The last collection is still in the making. Then now we come to the fragmentarium. If you noticed at the scheme, we originally planned to have like 100,000 lines in it. Today we have more than 400,000 lines of almost 30 tablets, 30,000 tablets and fragments. It is a huge collection of data. Each fragmentarium page of the individual tablets and fragments has three columns. The left column contains the most important data concerning the fragment, that is, which museum it is housed at, if it is meant to join certain other fragments, its size, its archaeological context, if known, and what kind of text it contains, the already published literature on that very fragment, and if it belongs to the corpus of one certain project, then a logo of the project. In the middle, you find the actual text edition. If you have an editor account, you can see the EBL ATF and modify it as far as you wish to, but otherwise you see the display mode, which is actually following the current assyriological conventions. Just like the corpus editions, the fragmentarium editions can also be lemmatized, so each attestation of a word can be directly linked to the dictionary. And also from the dictionary, you can find the individual attestations. On the right, you see the photograph of the tablet. And just like in the corpus, you can download most of its material. You can download the photo itself, and you can download the text editions in Word, PDF, whatever formats you need for your purpose. Maybe I will come back to this text science button at a later point. As for the photographs, the EBI project has been funded substantial photo projects as well. So, for instance, the British Museum and the Iraq Museum. In the British Museum, the entire Babylon collection has been photographed. This means more than 20,000 tablets, which the museum itself probably would never have had the means to photograph it by itself. And the photographing often included the conservation of the tablets as well. We have also been cooperating with other photo projects at the Penn Museum and the Yale Babylonian collection, but I cannot go into more detail here. Beside the photographs, we also have so-called folios. We call folios the handwritten notes, sometimes even hand copies of tablets that were usually left unpublished by previous scholars. And they or their academic successors agreed that we might digitize them, index them, and display them under all relevant fragments. It is extremely useful because you don't have to begin your text edition from scratch. And moreover, some of these folios are really old. So sometimes it might happen that the one who had seen the very tablet 100 years before you was still able to see signs that they are no longer there. So sometimes it preserves an earlier state of preservation of a tablet. This is a list of folios we already have, and others are still being collected. Now back to the fragmentarium. You can search here for very different aspects. You can search for literature, the different periods a tablet was written in, different places, the different genres you are interested in. We continue updating it with further sections, different words and lemmas, and you can also combine all these search functions. One of the main difficulties of cuneiform writing is one of the main difficulties lies in the polyphonic nature of cuneiform script. That means one sign can have a lot of very different readings depending on the place, the period, and also the context. So if you don't have a context because you have only 1 or 2 signs per line, it is very often impossible to tell what the right reading will be, because you don't know which readings you should use of the many that are possible. So this is an example of 2 signs next to each other, a dish and ku, which could mean I, or to sit, or to the bottom, or buttocks, depending on the context. For this reason, EBL has mastered this challenge by not searching for the readings themselves, but for the signs behind them. So if you check these three signs, ki, kal, and ud, you will see that, well, there are a good many of readings possible, depending on place, period, context, whatever. And if you search for this sequence of signs, ki, kal, and ud, it is all the same which readings you use for your search. It will provide you with a list of fragments that have the same sequence, irrespective of the reading we used in the edition. It is a feature that no other cuneiform database had before. Others are trying now to follow EBL in this respect. I come back to this fragment I just showed to you because it has been considered as a possible piece of a composition called the Greek prayer to Nabu. Nabu is a scribal god, and these Greek prayers are typical of having a ruling after every second line. So it was a plausible assumption, but you could not tell which part of the text it would belong to, because it's too fragmentarily preserved. By the use of EBL, it turned out that it actually belongs to a completely different text. It is a medical compendium dealing, in this case, with different diseases of a man's buttocks. Medical texts very frequently use these rulings in order to divide the text into different recipes. And as you can see, it is purely by chance that this small fragment has a ruling after each second line, because otherwise other sections have rulings after the third line or the fifth line and so on. Rulings can also be used in other ways. This fragment is very poorly preserved. We could tell it is something of divinatory nature, but it was impossible to read this text in its entirety. But the rulings were very useful because our developers provided a function called matching. This matching provides numerical values of the structure of rulings within the text. And we'll show you fragments that feature very similar patterns of ruling. So fragments that might belong to the same tablet. And this is how we were able to find out that these fragments belong to one and the same tablet. I don't know if it would have ever been possible without using EBL. We did find a good many of joins. This is what I told you about the jigsaw puzzle at the beginning. We found more than 1,500 joins in approximately 6 years. For comparison, it is approximately 25% of what was found at the British Museum in 150 years. So it's quite remarkable progress. And we always love finding joins because it always gives you new insights as to the understanding of the text. Now I would talk a couple of words about the other tools. Our student assistants spend quite a lot of time tagging the text editions. It means they use the text editions provided at the fragmentarium and mark the individual signs on the photographs we already have. This is extremely useful because we have developed a sign list for EBL, and this sign list can automatically fetch the individual tagged sign attestations. This means, well, it's not that important for you. This paleographic collection contains in this way not only abstract forms of individual signs, like every published sign list, but it contains actually attested sign forms, and thus also includes the different scribes' handwriting. So it is not an abstract form of what a sign could look like, but they actually preserve sign forms. We also have a couple of other tools that might be interesting. This is a date converter that converts ancient dates to modern or modern dates to ancient. It is already implemented into the fragmentarium. So if you have like a Neo-Babylonian document from the 2nd year of Nebuchadnezzar II, the 11th month, the 30th day, it will automatically tell you which modern date it would correspond to. We also have a cuneiform converter. This is also one of the more recently implemented features. It will convert whatever text you want to convert into cuneiform and whatever period you prefer, so Neo-Assyrian, Neo-Babylonian, Hittite, Old Babylonian, and you can also directly copy this cuneiform to your clipboard. A couple of words about the future prospects. We have decided to open the EBL platform into other directions beyond literature, which is why we renamed Electronic Babylonian Literature to Electronic Babylonian Library, in order to account this broader perspective. We also started to extend the corpora into different genres, like divinatory text, medical text, and magical text. These are already associated with other projects who decided to bring their text editions to EBL. So the divinatory corpora is currently being worked on by the Shuma'alu project in Geneva. This is a project on terrestrial omens. So whatever happens if a snake comes to your house, what future events might be expected, and the medical texts by the Nineveh project, which aim to re-edit all the medical tablets in Ashurbanipal's library. The future of the EBL platform is secure due to a cooperation with the Cake project, Uniform Artifacts of Iraqi Context. This is a long-term project funded by the Bavarian Academy of Sciences to up to 25 years. So we continue developing new features, extending our database into further collections and other genres. And hope you will check out our site and find it useful. Thank you for your attention.
Yes. Thank you very much for these wonderful insights in this on this project, and I hope, yes, we will have time also for questions later on also on this presentation. And I would like now to introduce our last speaker before the coffee break, and Marina Sartori, that I see online. Good morning. So Marina Sartori is an SNSF-funded postdoctoral researcher, mobility fellowship, idiosyncratic graphic register in ancient Egyptian manuscripts at the University of Oxford at the Faculty of Asian and Middle Eastern Studies. And her main research interests are ancient Egyptian visual culture and art history, hieroglyphic paleography, and especially polychrome hieroglyphs. She has extensively published her research, and among her most recent contributions might be cited Talking Images, a semiotic and visual analysis of 3 18th dynasty tombs in Deir el-Medina, published in 2022, and Visual Studies in TT 84, published in 2021. So welcome, Marina, and I leave you the floor.
Thank you so much. I hope everybody can hear me and see the slides as well. Yes. Perfect. So first of all, I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me to participate in this wonderful conference, even if only virtually, unfortunately, for this time. In the next few minutes, I will give you a short overview of my current research project, as mentioned by Leah, And this focuses precisely on the rare presence of polychrome text sections in funerary manuscripts of the Egyptian New Kingdom, a presence which, as we shall see, aims primarily at monumentalizing the manuscript and the text itself. Okay. 1 second, somehow I've done something weird. So I will do so by first going through the different options concerning the use of color and the funerary manuscript that scribes have at their disposal, and then focus more on the polychrome inscriptions in the very few manuscripts that I could find during my research. And afterwards, I will then illustrate more in detail the paleography of the selected signs to better understand the relation between the use of color and the morphology of hieroglyphs in a linear versus or cursive versus a monumental context, that is tomb chapels. And precisely, I will conclude by discussing the relationship between manuscripts and monumental layout and format. As we have seen already in Gael's talk, the graphic register typical for funerary manuscripts is linear hieroglyphs with more or less inner details. And as far as color is concerned, the text is mostly written in black paint. We also have so-called rubrics in red used for spell titles, names of dangerous creatures, and special instructions. However, there is much more variation in the use of color as previously observed. In fact, intriguingly enough, within a rubric, for example, certain parts of the text can be highlighted within the highlighting, let's say, by reverting to black. And in rare cases, even by being painted in blue, which is a rather expensive color to produce. In addition, within the black text, some signs, such as here, the woman giving birth, can be partially painted in solid black, thus introducing a sort of bichrome or color alternation that brings the sign closer to a monumental counterpart, since it makes the inner details stand out more, or the inner parts of the hieroglyph stand out more. Alternatively, certain hieroglyphs might be fully painted black, such as here, the hair, but the approach is not consistent. And the 3 lines across, we have once the hieroglyph of the hair fully painted in black, and once instead simply drawn as a silhouette. Some parts of the text, especially but not only captions to vignettes at the beginning of the scroll, can be also fully painted, such as here in the Book of the Dead of Ka. And in this case, in the Book of the Dead of Ka, these more monumental hieroglyphs are even painted fully in blue. And I would like again to stress the fact that this is a color that would have raised the prestige of the scroll, since it's a rather expensive and complex paint to produce. And in other cases, even though the morphology of the signs is not particularly elegant or detailed, the use of a different paint again underscores the importance of this scene and raises the visual appeal of the selected part of the scroll. However, so as we can see, there are so many different ways of using color to monumentalize linear hieroglyphs, but the most impressive and the most rare of all is the use of multiple paints for single signs. So what I call polychrome hieroglyphs. And up until now, I could only find very few manuscripts featuring polychrome text. They are basically free from the 18th dynasty or later New Kingdom, let's say, likely originating from Thebes, which are Bidi Yuya, the Book of the Dead of Yuya, the Book of the Dead of Kenna, which features the longest polychrome text, a hymn, and the Book of the Dead of Nacht, which we will be looking at in the next slide. Other manuscripts are also the Book of the Dead of Merit, which, however, is incomplete and only presents these 2 columns of more or less polychrome hieroglyphs. And be the Book of the Dead of Sarah Moon, which I won't be taking into consideration here because it dates to the 21st dynasty and it's being examined by Émile Joubert. I did find some other very, very tiny fragments, but they only feature a couple of signs, so they are not very useful for comparison. However, the most intriguing manuscript is the Book of the Dead of Nacht, which is peculiar on several layers. First of all, because of the polychrome inscription, but also because it's actually a mixed manuscript, meaning that it's composed of part in skin membrane, so animal skin, let's say something similar to parchment, and papyrus. The polychrome inscription features precisely on the opening of the scroll, which is made of leather, as you can see from the picture. And the color palette includes more or less all the colors found also in a monumental context. What is also intriguing is that whereas certain signs may have been simply may have a simpler morphology, they have been painted with a yellow filling in order to underscore a bit more this polychromy. And indeed, precisely this multicolor execution of the signs is so important, and it's considered so relevant in monumentalizing the inscription that even when the names and titles of the royal scribe and military commander Nacht are added secondarily by a different hand, the polychromy needs to be maintained. So we can see at a first glance that this part of the inscription is rather different from this other part. However, the scribes who added the names and the name and titles tried to somehow have the addition fit in the rest of the text by somehow mimicking the polychromy through the use of red paint on top of black, and vice versa in certain cases. And similarly, the same can be said of the names and titles of Nacht's wife and daughter, Tuyo and Takai, whose names have been written in a rather coarse hand, I would say, where we can see that the drafts below had been written in red and haven't been properly over-painted with neat outlines, actually. However, again, the scribes have tried to keep the polychrome execution by filling the open spaces of the hieroglyphs with yellow paint. You can't see it very well, maybe here, but I can assure you it's there. And it's even so rather shiny, so we may think it's a pigment called orpiment, which is rather gold-looking, let's say. So, and all these examples, again, underscore the importance of the use of color in raising the prestige and aesthetical value of this part of the scroll and text. As I mentioned, polychrome hieroglyphs are typical of the monumental context, that is tomb chapels, funerary chapels, but not manuscripts. So I tried to compare more in detail polychrome hieroglyphs from the few different manuscripts with polychrome inscription and with contemporaneous Theban tombs, in order to see whether there are some connections on the practical level and as well as on the visual level. And when we look at them, we realize that each manuscript has its own scribal features, obviously, but in some way they all are comparable with the paleography found in contemporaneous tombs. As far as the use of color is concerned, in polychrome signs such as this, we have a clear, although never perfect, overlap. So the body of the seated god, for example, is mostly white or red, and in the case of Kena and Duya is white, just as in the example from Theban tomb 69. But we have other examples with a red body, just as in the Book of the Dead of Nacht. The outline is red, as we can see both in tombs examples and in manuscript examples. And the wig and the beard are usually blue. However, some differences are still present, of course, so that Nacht and Kenna, for example, are less detailed, so they do not feature the inner eye, which is present instead in the book of the Yuya and most often in Theban tombs. Whereas Yuya is closer in morphology to the Theban tombs counterparts, but is slightly different from the color point of view, because the Book of the Dead of Yuya doesn't feature blue paint in the polychrome inscription, despite Yuya being actually higher in rank than Kenna or Nacht. Similar considerations can be made for design of the hair, but this time it is the Book of the Nacht which shows the highest level of detail and the closest morphology to paleography. However, again, it's never a one-to-one overlapping, and each sign is a performance in space and time. As we can see, so that, for example, in the Book of the Dead of Yuya, the scribes have chosen black outlines for the upper part of the body and red outline for the lower part, as if trying to add a sort of three-dimensionality to the hieroglyphic sign. When talking about signs painted usually in one color within the inscription, we can see that manuscripts seem to follow closely graphic trends found in contemporaneous tomb decoration, in this case blue. So the sky and the tea bread are usually painted in blue on both supports. On both writing supports. However, as we have seen, this happened only in the Nacht and Kenna's manuscripts, because Yuya doesn't feature any blue. Similarly, signs commonly read in tombs are also read in the manuscripts, such as human figures and parts of the human body. But maybe because the scribes were so used to writing in red on manuscripts, precisely these signs, the signs written in red, are the ones which are closer in morphology to linear hieroglyphs than to monumental hieroglyphs. And lastly, we come to the great absent, which is green. At the moment, I couldn't really find a manuscript featuring inscriptions with green present in the polychrome inscription. Yeah. So the scribes somehow find other solutions to replace the color green. So whereas in Theban tombs we would find this color, in a manuscript we find instead a yellow filling, which is completely absent from contemporary tomb decoration instead. And another option found in the manuscript of Nacht is instead replacing the color green by simple black lines. And just as we have seen with the red examples, it seems as if when scribes revert to simple black, they seem to switch to a more linear way of executing the signs. So despite these paleographic differences between polychrome hieroglyphs on the two different media, manuscripts and tomb walls, and most notably the absence of green pigment, the graphic connection between the two writing supports is evident, to the point that scholars such as Peter Dorman have defined the manuscripts written in hieroglyphs as monumental, as opposite to manuscripts written in hieratic, the script connected most often to everyday communication. And in fact, when looking at the few manuscripts with polychrome text, we notice that the latter so that the polychrome inscription always features at the beginning of the scroll, and usually precisely in scenes of the adoration of Osiris, seated in his kiosk of the god Osiris, being adored by the deceased and his family. And this icon is present in innumerable elite Theban tombs of the same period, and again is most often captioned through polychrome text. So the examples here show perfectly the strong intermediality between manuscripts and tomb decoration. And in particular, the case of the manuscript of Nacht is relevant because it shows the whole family of the deceased, which is rather rare on manuscript. And it has a perfect comparison in the tomb of Ka, in the tomb chapel belonging to Ka. Again, a rather rare occurrence. And the wish to monumentalize the specific part of the specific scene of the scroll is evident also in the fact that these vignettes usually follow the rules of monumental depictions, including the direction and the orientation of the text, as it has already been remarked also by Dorman. And the need to bring the specific scene, the adoration of the god, at the very start of a manuscript, closer in layout and choice of script to a monumental depiction, is confirmed even in later exemplars dated to the third intermediate period. So here, even when hieratic becomes again the most dominant script for Books of the Dead manuscripts, the opening vignette almost needs to be written in hieroglyphs, be they fully painted as here, or be they the linear hieroglyphs that up until that moment had been used for the body of the text, or any kind of cursive hieroglyphs or hieroglyphs at all, as in the case here of the Book of the Dead of Anges. So this trend seems consistent across space and time. And concluding, we can say that the need to visually connect certain parts of a manuscript to monumental inscriptions in tombs is evident. However, as it appears, there is not just one way to monumentalize the text, but rather the scribes have at their disposal a whole range of options, what I call here the monumentality spectrum, which can go from rather detailed linear hieroglyphs, which may or may not feature inner details or fully painted hieroglyph signs, to fully painted solid hieroglyphic text, to let's say bichrome or hieroglyphs, to a whole range of polychrome hieroglyphs featuring a more or less extensive color palette. With this, I would like to thank you for your attention and look forward to your comments.
Thank you very much for showing this impressive material. I'm sure that also for this paper, we will have a lot of questions later on. And now is, however, the time for the coffee break, but we should a little bit, according to the new schedule, we can start again around 1:15 or something like this.
Yeah, we can go for the coffee now, and we come back in 40 minutes or something like that. We can go downstairs, we go together, and we have the coffee there, so nobody gets lost.
So we'll just write also in the chat when we start again, so everyone knows via Zoom. The second or the third part of today's panel. So I'd like to yes, your attention to welcome our next speaker, Niv Allon, and welcome and thank you for joining here in Alcalá. And Niv is a curator in the Department of Egyptian Art at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, where he focuses on the display and interpretation of Ramesside art and textual objects throughout Egyptian history. He has extensively published on the scribal culture and literacy in ancient Egypt, and among his many contributions might be mentioned his monograph, Writing Violence and the Military Images of Literacy in the 18th Dynasty Egypt, published in 2019, and his article, Finding a Voice in a Hymn to Ramses IX, published in 2021 in the journal Studien zur altägyptischen Kultur. And in addition, he's currently preparing a publication on the hieratic jar labels from the palace city of Amenhotep III at Malkata with Sherif Abdel Moniem. And welcome again, and I leave you the floor.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much, Carlos and Josan, for inviting me for this conference. I just have to say, I am very jet lagged. Basically, I am awake, but my brain is completely asleep. I'll try to get it through the talk. As Leah, and thank you for the introduction, mentioned, this is, I mean, I've been working on scribal culture, and this paper is very much part of this. In recent years, I've been working with Sherif Abdel Monim, who's, I think you might, some might know, Lisa might know, and others, on the material side of the jar labels. And Angela has already heard me kind of talk about some aspect when extending slightly outside the question of the jar labels. And in many ways, this conference pushed me to kind of have another step forward and look at other writing materials in Malkata and ask questions about text and matter over there. And so for the longest time and until this morning, I couldn't decide between this kind of neatly laid out slide versus this one that actually expresses much more my confusion and my questions and amazement and bewilderment for the love of God, seal impressions from the Festival Palace. And actually, it has different aspects here because as you'll see, one of the main arguments I have here, or one of the main things I'm interested in is also the love that is kind of one of the main matters of Malkata, as seen from the seal impressions. But for us to get there, really the material aspect of the seal impression is something that allows the story and the questions to unravel and unfold and basically move almost from a one-dimensional aspect to a three-dimensional picture of the site. But another thing I should say is also that since it's a kind of a newer foray for me into questions of seal impressions and those questions, I am following the footsteps of many other scholars who know much more about this material than I do, and have been insightful and amazingly helpful in understanding some of the questions. But I invite any comments or questions afterwards in the discussion, because as I said, this is really me trying to make sense with the help of various people of this material. And so when I talk about love and when I talk about material, I'm gonna kind of go through the process around 4 subjects, starting kind of with widening or broadening visions of the thing itself. I'm starting with the sealing, with the production in a way, and then moving to the surface, kind of looking at what it's being attached to, questions of the back and what the surface is, and then into the distribution, where you find it at the site, what do you find at the site, kind of looking at the sealing as an artifact more than just like an iconography that you can learn and copy, and then going back to my other interests that relate to the textual landscape. How does it relate then to other texts that you find at the site? So just a few words of introduction about Malkata. We are next to Luxor, to Thebes. This is a map from Hays' 1951's publication of the city palace of Amenhotep III. So basically, it's a complex of temples and palaces that were used mainly for the said festival of the king. And what then makes it so fantastic as a site is that you can date the material even before you approach it. Most of it comes from between year 30 to year 38 of Amenhotep III, and we know a lot about it from the jar labels that I mentioned working on. We have about 1,400 jar labels at the Met, And recently, Sharif went to Cairo and found, or is now looking and processing the other material that's there. Here's another view of the site. And then the Met excavated at the beginning of the 20th century there. This is one of the photos from our archives of the palace city as it was found. And then there's a wonderful pictures that I often like to show that has the ceiling with a sea as it was found on the floor of the palace, and then how it's reconstructed now at the Met's galleries. But it also kind of gives an idea or a sense of the fragmentary, the sense of what you can find and how you can reconstruct from it. But questions such as Pinar has raised of like, what are you showing? How far are you from the original? What is the original itself? Among the wonderful paintings and other materials that one finds at the site, there's a real treasure for me, which are the jar labels that you can see really at the bottom over there. These are mostly meat jar labels, which are exciting in many ways, but that allows us then to start to reconstruct questions that relate to scribal hands, practices, and because it's so well dated and because it's so, in a way, formulaic, it allows a lot of signs to appear again and again and again, and then you can start comparing and asking questions about scribal practices there. So maybe among the best examples that you can find is the jar on the left, which in this case also preserves the neck, which is a rarity. And a lot of jars were then sealed also, or at least I think we found about 90 of them, or Winlock found about 190 of the those mud covers, mud ceilings on the jars themselves. These are not what I'm talking about in this talk, but we'll go back to these later on. So as I mentioned in Hayes' publication 1951, which is to this day the main publication of the site, a series of 4 articles, really brilliant and helpful and insightful, but just an introduction to a later work that is yet to come. And he breaks down then with the jar labels, what do we find in what year and what commodity, and that's very then allows us to kind of also understand some of the chronology of those celebrations. When it comes to the seal impressions, which I show an example of here, they are basically, as you saw from Pinar's explanation, they're often muds being pressed in around cords very often, and then a stamp either through a scarab or a ring is used to make an impression on them. And one struggle really, and one thing that one has to be amazed at is how one moves from these difficult to read, fragmentary, broken, missing aspects to, sorry for the blurry images, but what you have in the back, which are his types of different seals that he shows. So he collected about 123 of them. That are hard to see, but that's a major stopping point in the publication of these. But also one needs to understand this is about 40 years after they were excavated. So he's already working kind of far from the excavation itself. And then in the 80s, we have Candy Keller, who has been working on the jar labels and on these as well. And these are her notes and photographs as she was preparing the publication, which sadly was never published. But she gives a paper in 1988 that people then quote and refer to. But this is just to say, I rely a lot on their analysis and thoughts, and I'm grateful to that kind of work itself. And then that leads us then to the question of production. From ceiling to seal and back. So as I mentioned, you have mud, you lumps, and then you push the seal, the scarab, the ring into it to create different designs. Very common, you have the name of the king and different aspects around it. What's really stunning to me as I was pulling them from the shelf and looking at them is sometimes how much detail you can see on the impression itself. I was expecting it to be very fragmentary, eroded and fragmentary, and maybe also just, quickly pushed and then pulled out. But no, we have here wings with feathers, as you can see. If you look on your left, there's the image of Thoth, even has delineation of the wig, and then the mare, the sign for love, is written with ripples, with waves. Again, not something I ever expected to see in a seal impression, but I might be wrong. Then, since as I said, the story kind of starts to unfold, we have here people not just impressing it one, but they sometimes you impress a few times as expected, and then with different directions, kind of sealing the deal in a way, and often also then starting to stamp one over another, kind of bringing up questions of legibility, what you can actually read from an inscription, from a seal that cuts into another seal or covers parts of it, and reshapes it. But then this is not just one person going around and sealing stuff. We have different seals being used, which suggests that there's a combination of worker at the site, people sealing and inscribing. And these all examples of type 17 and 33 that come from West Villa B, which I'll mention later again. And then, so when Hayes uses the word type, it's sometimes hard to understand what he's exactly thinking about, and types is very... I said type, and look at the... I should use type from later. Is then what does it actually mean to us about the practice itself, the production? And when you look at these three examples, they're all S45 falling under one type, but clearly the one on the left is actually done in a very different fashion from the ones from the other two. It's carved into the seal rather than raised relief. Sorry, the other way around. And then actually between the two examples of the S45 that do resemble another, there are also significant differences. But one caveat I have to mention, since seals are often then tried, like as you create more than one example, sometimes on one clay lamp, you then also affect the way they look. So then you have to question yourself, especially when one is, of course, photography and how difficult it is to photograph, but then also questions of whether there are other things around that change the shape of the signs themselves. But at least it seems like S73, which we have the most examples from, we have three that look, at least to Keller, as coming from the same seal itself. And then you have other distinctions, for example, how thinly the Thoth image is made. You can see one that's very narrow, the other one that is actually much thicker, when the other figures seems to be of the same nature. And then the angle of the Ma'at, of the Neb Ma'at sign that you see is also kind of suggesting different stamp being used. And that kind of opens in the question of, can we read something from a type into a sealer, from a seal to a person? Some people have suggested to go in the direction, whereas if you look at the example itself, it suggests at least that we have different people using the same seal or different seals being used, which makes sense, but still it then creates a different image in our mind of how the administration looks. Then we go to the question of surface, of what it's attached to. So in the publication itself of Hayes in 1951, it's published as document sealing, which suggests that then at the site we have a very busy administrative office, archives, whatever, correspondence, that things are sent to and from, sealed with cord, as you can see here in this example. But once again, and this is something that Stuart Tyson Smith already showed, especially with the Malkata seals, there are actually many more questions to be asked about what is it being attached to. Because this example over here, actually, if you look at the back of it, there are those lines that resemble much more, and sorry for the blurry images. Believe you me, when Nadine Muller publishes in 2012 the sealing that she finds in Edfu, they have the same marks, and these come from basketry. And similar to what Pinar showed from the Penn Museum as an example. Again, then Hayes, when he publishes, he emphasizes the clear imprint of papyrus with the fibers running on one side from end to end of the roll. But what others have pointed out, usually papyrus doesn't leave only one direction of signs. It's much more, I'll show in a second, a different direction of signs. And then that's where Candy Keller isn't alive, sadly. She passed away. And clearly in '88, she gave in the presentation an idea that these are not papyri being sealed, but in her manuscript, unpublished manuscript, we still have it as impressions of papyrus fibers and cord binding over them. So when we look actually at the material itself, those lines, and there's a curvature, suggest that this is definitely not how you seal a papyrus. And also usually there's more of a matrix behind, not just lines running in one direction. A lot of what we have at the site actually are closer to peg sealing, which is usually being used either to seal doors or boxes. Both are possible, and both would make sense in an administration of a site that's dedicated to donations being sent or received at the site. So we have to kind of depart from numerous scribes writing and sending letters and accept the fact that we actually have a very busy administrative donation system receiving donations and gifts and produce to the site. So as I mentioned, we have those peg, and there are probably signs of wood behind it, other examples. And the blurriness continues. Okay, then the third aspect is distribution. We are kind of moving from the ceiling itself to seeing it's in the context of other ceilings at the site. And there's a lot. We have 1,100, which compared to the Middle Kingdom is a really minuscule number. It's about a quarter of what we find a quarter and more and less of what we find in different fortresses in Nubia, for example. But one has to remember still, this is a site that was active for about 8 years. So I think that kind of may give us a different flavor of what's going on. The majority of these, there's about 630 examples found from type 73, which I already mentioned, probably belongs to different people. And then the rest kind of a lot of them appear only once or twice, I would say. And so in Hayes' publication, he kind of talks about where they probably come from and how you find them at the site, which is a very significant step forward in understanding how they operated. Again, I'm big on caveats. One big caveat, because we are far away from the excavation itself, we come to a point in which one has to make decisions, the practical side, and then a comment in our archives mentions that this specific type was found in West Villa B and at the King's Palace, and therefore one was cataloged in this way and another was cataloged in another way. So sometimes it's very hard then to know which specific ceiling was found at what part of the site. We can only kind of use Hayes' notes to think what Winlock found and then how it's been recorded in our system, which, as I mentioned, this is where For the Love of God kind of plays into. At the site itself, 70% of the ceilings come from one specific place, the West magazines of what's called the Palace of the King. And what Stuart Tyson Smith showed, 70% come from there, and there are 3 stamps that are found there very regularly, which I show here. The other place that has a large number of seals is storeroom, or sometimes called West Villa B, that has a lot of different ceilings, but of various types. There's none that really jumps much more than others. So Stuart Tyson Smith, I think, makes a lot of sense in saying we have here 2 different kind of operation. One is actually very much tied to a storeroom that processes and seals things as they arrive. And what's happening in West Villa B, that's a big question. We don't exactly know. He then goes into the step that's suggesting that a seal type or seal 73 reflects a specific person. But as I showed before, I think we have to be very careful about those assumptions. I think they're much more probably tied to operation of a specific unit in administration. Another question then I ask myself is then how does it relate to the fact that we have said festivals from different years. And this is only a first step in the process. I'll have to do more research in the archives, but basically Hays have a typology of the jar labels, and they are luckily dated specifically, year 30, year 34. So when you look at that and how they correspond to the ceiling, in the palace, it extends from, I mean, there you have stuff that arrives from earlier, from the year 30, probably being brought to the site, but extends to around year 36, from what I could see. Whereas West Villa B is slightly later in date, year 35 to 37. So what I'm trying to think about, I'm starting to think about is maybe we might have two different units in operation, but also we also have different chronologies. Maybe there are different operations. Year 37 is already when the site is about to be done almost. The third festival is being celebrated. Year 38, probably Amenhotep III passes away. So it might be related to dismantling of whatever was going on rather than things being processed. But again, these are more questions to be asked from the archives. And then finally, the textual landscape. As I mentioned, at the site, you have different texts being inscribed, probably by the same group of people or by the same administration at least. We have jar labels, we have painted jar labels, we have a stamp on this ceiling, the cover of the jar, and also painted above. And each one of them, what I find so interesting about them is that each one of them kind of gives us a different view, a different horizon into how the administration conceptualizes itself, time, space, the king, and kind of relates to questions I'm often interested in, that relates to what's the idea of the king and kingship in the Egyptian society. When we look at the jar labels, they are very commodity oriented, but also very specific to whoever the scribe was. Sometimes the butcher is named, whereas the king is often either named Neb Matre or Amenhotep. So the king exists in a kind of in a very rich society with many people operating around him, and it's very specific to a date, kind of tied to what sometimes people talk about with, I mean, someone like Pascal Vernous about how hieratic is very sensitive to the event itself. We don't see the same kind of sensitivity to years. We do see commodities, for example, on those stamps on the ceiling. They also name divinities on them. And rarely they mention the king with a specific god, but very often just the name of the king in different celebrations of the said festival. So when we come back to our ceilings, 2 out of every 3 of them talk about love. And I'm not talking about love of the king. I mean, yes, I do. But how the king is beloved of the gods. And that's something that is very interesting just to consider of why is there a different aspect of kingship that being celebrated by those ceilings impression. But it's also interesting for me to consider how different people are then constantly engaging. 600, 700 example of people stamping the love of the king by the gods on mud lamps, which just maybe tells us a different image of what's happening at the site, not just administration as a bureaucratic practice, but also something that has maybe somewhat of a more worship, celebration. A lot of those seals, even they don't have the word love, they have the name of the king, and they have an image, a small image of the king stamped on it as part of the name Neb Matre. So I hope running through those 4 aspects of production, surface, distribution, and textual landscape, I was able to convince you it's mostly about love, and that material really helps here kind of rethink the site and what's happening in it. What I often, and again, this goes back to Pinar, what I think, what is also beautiful about it, it makes you think about the people themselves working in it. And so you keep finding those fingerprints everywhere, all the time, sometimes on the seals themselves. And that's also one of the key things that made me think about someone is keep touching them. They cannot stop touching it. And I'll finish with a conundrum. We have a ball, stamped 8 times, mostly with the same stamp. For what it was used, I am not sure. It resembles other things, but none that I know from ancient Egypt. But again, you might send me to things that you do know. But it's definitely not used for documents, I would say. And then thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Niv. And this was a fascinating presentation. I have already a question ready for later. So I will now briefly introduce our next speaker and welcome Angela MacDonald. So she has an MA in Ancient Greek and Latin from University of St. Andrews and a Master of Philosophy and Doctor of Philosophy in Egyptology from the University of Oxford. She was a founding member of the Current Researchers in Egyptology Conference series, most of you probably know in this room, and she has been teaching at the University of Glasgow for over 20 years and currently a senior lecturer in Egyptology within the Department of Classics. She has published several books and articles on ancient Egypt, among which her monograph, The Ancient Egyptians, Their Lives and Their World, published in 2008, and organized an extensive series of courses and lectures at the University of Glasgow in Egyptology, archaeology, and other aspects of the history of the ancient world. Her research focuses on ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs in hieratic, and particularly the determinative system. But she is deeply interested in the context and materiality of ancient Egyptian artifacts and works closely with the Hunterian Museum in Glasgow. So I will leave you the floor and welcome.
Thank you very much, and thank you so much for the invitation to be here as well today. I'm delighted to be here. I've got no excuse for jet lag because I'm just 5 minutes down the road, but I might manage to be slightly daft, so bear with me. We'll see. So today, I guess I'm speaking a little bit about the intersection between materiality, which we're talking about for this section of the conference, but also movement and dynamics. I'm really interested in trying to track that kind of movement element across material. So I start with the idea of stillness. So many of the artifacts that we're looking at look as if they're static and still. And in fact, some of them look as if they've been deliberately created to be a snapshot of a particular moment that won't change. And it's easy to forget that many objects do incorporate this idea of movement. Yeah, they are meant to move. So what happens when we're looking at texts? Texts might seem like a very static series of entities for us to consider. So here's one that's back in my native city of Glasgow. We'll look at a line drawing of it briefly. So it looks as if it's very still, but there's directionality obviously there. And we've touched upon that a little bit this morning, this wonderful talk on retrograde. And there's a little bit here for you, just for you. So when we're playing with this and when we're thinking of how to read it, then we think about the direction that the hieroglyphs are moving in. And we also imagine ourselves as a kind of reader who will appear interacting with the hieroglyphs. So we read into the faces of our hieroglyphs, and that establishes directionality and a little bit of movement in text that might be otherwise a bit static. But there are texts that challenge that. So, and this is one, it looks fairly simple, right to left in the top two lines, but then that third line, we start in the center and move to the left, or we start in the center and move to the right, both at the same time. And we could get carried away thinking that this is all for the benefit of a reader, yeah? So again, moving into the text and then deciding how they're going to orientate themselves around a stela like this. But the signs have directionality of their own. And whereas we might think that interacting with us, I wonder if they have their own agenda, their own set of dynamics. So that third line, rather than us starting in the center and moving out to the left and right, maybe it's more about not the reader, but the signs themselves, what's going on in the monument, that this line comes together and interconnects instead. And that's to do with the people who are being shown. So a son on the left, as I'm looking at it here, and a father on the right who mirrored each other, the son taking on the father's titles. The mother is there as well, represented textually rather than visually, although she gets her own little determinative, whereas the son and the father don't. And then it becomes about materializing presences, yeah? a little bit static, but there are little movements perhaps hidden. I was playing with this stela yesterday because I fiddle with my slides up until the last possible moment. And I was looking just at purely what may be a graphic quirk, that you get these three little arms arranged. Now, we're not reading that textually. These are all embedded in their own separate words, these arms. But isn't it a little bit reminiscent of the presence of the son and the mother and the father? Two parental hands and one son reaching towards one another as just a nice little incidental quirk. So there's all sorts of ways to read an Egyptian text. There's what the text is saying, as it were, and we tend to be overly interested in that at the expense of what it might also be doing on the side. Yeah. So reader audience may be less important than we think in terms of materializing presences, materializing realities and agendas. I think there's a lot to be seen in the way that a text is put together. So that brings me on to my case study today. So this is the stela of a man called Uja-Horesnit or Uja-Horesni. I think I've tried to be consistent and I've left him with his final T. He's headless now and in the Vatican Museum. He's had a complex history. So there was a recent contribution dispelling the notion that he actually came from Hadrian's Villa, which I'm kind of disappointed about, actually. I'm a little sad. Now it's much more murky, his journey to Rome. But at various stages in his career, he acquired a woman's head. He's been identified as a lovely, voluptuous priestess wearing a pretty dress. And it's only been relatively recently that we've paid attention to the actual kind of realities of what he is. A potential Persian collaborator is one way to see it, or somebody who walked a very careful diplomatic line. His statue is covered in texts, and as Egyptologists, I think we dive in and we say, oh my goodness, what did they say? Because they give us tremendous detail on the mechanics of how Persian kings came in and established themselves within Egypt, and Uja-Horesnit helped with that. But because we're Egyptologists, we like to know where to start. So A, B, C, D, E, F, some of them in pairs. Where do we start? Yeah. And a very influential article by John Baines in the 90s said, well, you know, we can see that there's symmetry. So there's a lot of text arranged so that you've got two A's, two B's, two C's, with one exception, E. But ultimately, at the end of the day, it may just not be possible to read in any linear way. So starting with A, going on to B, going on to C, because the text defies that. So I want to play with that idea and take it a little bit further. So my idea is to give you a kind of overview of the text without going into too much detail. You do not have to read every single thing I put up here, because we're going to go beyond the actual words and get into the essence of how the text is arranged materially, really. But I wanted to give you the idea of how much symmetry is embedded in this statue, not just because you've got pairs of inscription, but because you've got ideas symmetrically arranged as well in interesting complements. So for example, this is the part of the text that wraps around the shrine that Uja-Horesnit is holding. On the one side, you get an offering formula dedicated to Osiris foremost in the palace. And on the other side, you get a very local form of Osiris to the town where this statue was set up, Osiris Hemag. So you've got two Osirises, but balanced with one another, not exactly symmetrical, but complementing one another, and all kinds of themes that come out in the texts. But an interesting recurring theme of this balance between the wider, the global, the cosmic across Egypt, all the gods, as opposed to what's going on locally, the gods of Sais or specific gods. So, and this continues as a theme across the statue in all its different inscriptions. So, for example, this wonderful cloak that he's wearing, it's unusual, and I don't know, just because of my own ignorance, at what point we start to get text written on garments. I suspect probably quite close to the production of these kinds of 26th dynasty texts going into the 27th dynasty. But it's interesting to see this. In Mesopotamia, I think we get much more willingness to inscribe on all sorts of different surfaces. But in Egypt, we're generally finding things on pillars and sides, not interfering with bodies themselves. But here we have it. So a cloak inscription, and again, this is really important historically. So we spend a lot of time dissecting the details of what the text says, collaboration with different Persian kings. But again, what's interesting here is that on the one side of the cloak, one set of collaborative activity enables another set of activities that benefit the people of Egypt. So there's an interesting balance and justification going on across the text. Moving on to the shrine support, so underneath the shrine itself and this little kind of pillar that holds it up, again, we see complementation, symmetry. We're just brushing by this quickly. This area particularly interests me. This is the area that nestles between the curve of Uduhareznet's arms on both sides and the inner walls of the shrine, and you get a specific area of text there. And this is all about protection, as you would expect in a sheltered area, and we're coming back to that. On the back pillar, this is a non-dual text. We just get one set of inscriptions going in columns, but it seems to be about a foundation. And this is the latest episode that we get narrated in the story of this man's life, the kind of end point where he's in Persia and he's sent back to Egypt to do various things back at home. And then finally, the plinth that the statue stands on has a short text that seems to blend together the past, what Uduhareznet has done, and what he hopes for the future. Right. Now we leave the words behind and we think about this as a material composition. So we're thinking about symmetry and playing the same games that we did with the stela that I showed you from Glasgow. So bringing up a little bit more of a detailed image, then we can see that we've got this idea of Uduhareznet being revered, right? In two places. So that comes together in the center, revered, before, yeah, a little bit funerary, I guess. Again, we were talking about this formula appearing on coffins and in various places. And then we get, two sets of gods on either side here. Now, as readers, we pull those apart, but I wonder if this is instead about a coming together. And again, underneath that first kind of line horizontally of text, we get two lines that explain Uduhareznet's identity nestling underneath that little pedestal that the Osirid shrine rests on. So mirrored writings of his title, the chief physician, and then mirrored writings of his name underneath with this shared little "it will be all right" sign in the center, again, kind of peeling out, meeting in the middle, interesting dynamics going on. And then as the horizontal lines give way to columns, vertical columns, we have two instances of Jed F, he says, yeah? Again, I wonder if the intention is that these two things come together and meet in the middle. We're interested in audience, right? When we're trying to pick apart this text and figure out what it says, but maybe it's not speaking to us. Maybe it's having a conversation internally within itself. But still, let's play the reader game. If we're a reader and we're standing in front of the statue, then we can work our way round towards the back and we follow the direction of the inscription on the cloak, and then we come to a stop at this back pillar, which halts us in our tracks, and we're not brought back round to the front again, hence one of the problems that John Baines was grappling with and others. But if instead we have not one reader, but two readers, because this is all about dualities, this text, and we pay attention to that, then actually something more interesting happens. We get a complementary motion of two readers going round to the back and meeting at that column that supports the whole statue. But let's leave readers entirely aside for the moment, and let's think instead about this as a material composition. Let's think instead about this back pillar as being a solid piece of stone that we start with his achievements ingrained. And let's see him as a person who's donning a cloak. Sorry, it does look a little bit like a bathroom sign. Forgive my clumsy graphics. So here's this cloak. not a text, but a cloak, yeah, covered with words and intentions and deeds that he's done. And so he moves behind this back pillar with his cloak and settles against it, and this gives him his backbone so that he's able to wrap his deeds around himself, right? We're not reading his words. This is more essential than that. And so everything that text is telling us becomes more like substance, almost like the material that this thing is made of. It's basalt, hard stone, yeah? And this gives you your solid foundation, reading this materially. Flipping round to the front, and we get him wrapping this cloak around himself, and part of its substance, as I say, gets trapped underneath his arms, between the arm and the side of the shrine. And that is a separate inscription. So all the things that he does with the Persian kings wrapped around himself, but this little protected area, which is part of the same cloak, becomes about what he does for his own people. Persians aside, here's the quiet space where he behaves like an Egyptian, yeah? So again, this periodical that published a whole series of articles about Uji-Khwarizmit, one of the articles is about domination and resistance, and I don't know if it's necessarily about that, but certainly there's almost a kind of determinative strand to the placement of this text, almost like text on a coffin, yeah? Meaningful positioning that seems to apply to this little sheltered area. Then there's the plinth on which he stands and the inscription that comes from that. And it echoes of beneficence, all the great things that Uji-Khwarizmit has done for Egypt, for the various kings that he's worked with, that he hopes in turn will come back and reflect upon him, as if he stands upon that idea, the goodwill that he has generated through his good actions. But I want to take apart the text a little bit, and you probably can't see my cursor. So this idea of that he was one who was revered before all his masters. Let's take that apart a little bit in a second. First, a bit of symmetry on the granular level. One thing that we do with Egyptian texts as Egyptologists is we break them apart. And we make them sit down and behave, damn it, as we would expect them to. So we put them into sentences. So I could perfectly respectively translate the text that I've got highlighted in blue here as the revered one before Neith, the mother of the god, and the gods of Sais. But actually what the text is doing is it's putting that revered one centrally and putting the gods on either side. There's Neith at the top, and there's the gods of Sais at the bottom, and the revered one, Uji-Khwarizmit, is sitting exactly between them. And I think that's relevant, yeah? We shouldn't compensate for it and elide it. And it's happening symmetrically on the other side. Here he is, revered again between his local god and all the gods. So you've got all sorts of little resonances going on between the local and the more universal. And this idea of symmetry and dualities, because Uji-Khwarizmit is a creature of those things. So when we come to look at that final inscription in hieroglyphs where he says, I was one who was revered before all his masters, I'm compensating, I'm reading it grammatically, I can play with it in various ways, but I think it's quite important to look at the positioning of that F and play that game of symmetry all over again, and maybe see this as him positioning himself between one master, Persia, and another master, Egypt. And then that changes how we translate this. It becomes instead maybe something like, I was one who was revered before and between his two masters. Yeah, so the materiality of the text arrangement should perhaps influence the way that we understand and translate this, even if it's beyond the grammatical kind of nitty-gritty. So finally, there are all sorts of things, compositions existing today. I picked one at random, but actually the hotel that we're staying in has them all over the place where you play with this line between text and image. But here's one by Jeffrey Fisher, where there's lots of words and you could pick them apart and you could arrange them in lines and you could figure out what they're doing and what they're saying. But it's really about the impact, the punch of seeing these things visually and materially. So it's not really about reading, yeah? It's about seeing, and it's about what's materialized in front of your eyes. And I think we should do the same with something like Uja statue. By all means, we want to read it. It's an important textual source, but we want to really see it as well. That it is the coming together of his past, everything that he's done. It's his present wrapping around himself to enable one set of actions, enabling another. And then it's his aspirations for the future, all materialized and brought together in this dynamic, wonderfully visual composition, a work of art. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this really very much fascinating presentation. So yes, hello, hi. So we start with the next speaker. It was very quick to come on stage, and so a few words to introduce our next speaker, Beatriz Noria Serrano, which is currently a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Pisa in the framework of the project PIPE, profiling the identity of the producers in ancient Egypt and Nubia through the hour of clay figurines. She graduated in history at the University of Sevilla and defended her master thesis in Egyptology at the University of Liverpool. She recently completed his PhD at the University of Alcalá in Madrid, and her thesis focused on the social and cultural aspect of motherhood during Middle Kingdom Egypt. Her work combines approaches and methodologies from Egyptology, linguistics, and anthropology to better understand the role of mothers in the society and religious mentality of the ancient Egyptians. She's a member of the Middle Kingdom Theban Project and Djibouti Project missions, which excavate the necropolises of Deir el-Bahari and Dra Abu el-Naga. So welcome, Beatriz, and I leave you the floor.
Thank you for the introduction, Leah. Where it is? No, más abajo, más abajo. Aquí, ese PDF. Well, while we are doing, yes, perfect. Sí, perfect. Okay, sorry for being rushing over here, kind of nervous. I would like to start, of course, by thanking Carlos and Gigi for organizing this amazing Congress, and of course, for inviting me and giving the opportunity to return to my alma mater. Nevertheless, I have to be completely honest. This Congress is out of my specialty, which, as Leah said, I'm more focused on maternal affiliation, gender studies, and recently clay figurines. So I'm out of my comfort zone. So please be kind. What I'm going to present you is, and I want to highlight these words, recent and ongoing research about the attestation of a practice that I caught my interest when I was doing my PhD here on Middle Kingdom stelae. Okay, so Middle Kingdom private stelae are well known by Egyptologists. Thank you, Angela, for already putting some of them. They have been used during years for the study of diverse topics such as society, administration, religion, and more recently, kinship. Their combination of text and iconography have made them useful tools to research the dynamics of the period because they are imbued in a mixture, a mass of signs and symbols that navigate between the deliberate intentions of the owner of the monument who wants to express his personal identity and, of course, the rigid social and cultural norms, most of them are expressed perhaps even unconsciously. In this sense, I think we all agree, and I hope so because I don't have time to talk about it, that stelae were intended to be seen, or most of them were intended to be seen, because they acted as foci of memory. They enhance the social enactment of the commemoration of the social groups. Well, so in terms of manufacture, the manufacture and designs of stelae from this period usually follows a very distinct pattern. They are often round top or rectangular limestone slabs with a few lines of hieroglyph inscriptions and figures either kneeling or standing in relationship to the owner of the artifact. Both text and images are usually inserted within margins that stelae mark as incised line that frames the front scena. However, this description that I just made offers a limited view of what a stela can potentially be, rendering them, as already Angela said, static and immutable artifacts that cannot be modified once they've been erected in their intended locations. And of course, these are not a stela, because a stela from Middle Kingdom can be shaped in different forms, different materials. That can be in wood, they can be in granite. They can feature hieratic script, and occasionally their back face also features scenes and inscriptions. So rather than being seen these few stela as exceptions to the norm, these variations should be considered significant elements that contribute to a deeper understanding of written culture, manufacturing processes, and the different stages in the life of the object. And I think in this regard, it is important to consider, because of the nature of the stela and their accessibility in most of the cases, it is likely, or it is possible, I would say, that even after being erected, they could have been relocated. There could have been inscriptions that has been erased, or other new ones have been added. For example, Stela Louvre C5 is mainly dedicated to the Chamberlain of the Office of the Treasurer, Sa-Sejit, who is depicted twice. Nevertheless, a possible college is also depicted in a position of authority, the Chamberlain of the Office of the Treasurer, Imani. Below him, in a smaller size, as you can see at the bottom of the stelae, is depicted the housekeeper of the palace, Pepi, who is represented in the same way. However, note that the inscriptions in the frame, the ones that are framing the entire arc of the object, do not reach the bottom, do not reach the scene of Pepi in this register. Considering this, the proportion of the last, and considering the proportion of the last register and the great number of servants that are bringing offerings to Pepi, this register may have been a later addition to the original format of the stela, perhaps when Pepi gained enough power or was able to have a closer relationship to the other main individuals of these two important officials who are depicted here in this monument. For this reason, I believe that a close observation of inscriptions in stelae can provide us with new insights of the production of these artifacts and the social relationships of those people who commanded. And in this way, I started to notice two unusual textual practices, writing on the margins and writing on the edge of the stelae. And my intention here is briefly to introduce them to you and to introduce you this practice and show certain patterns that I have noticed, rather than provide you a straightforward interpretations. This is something for the future. Okay, so inscriptions outside the carved frames of the front face of the stelae are likely a more widely recognized practice. In most cases, these inscriptions appear to be a continuation of sentence initially inscribed within the frames, where the scribe ran out of a space, so we just wanted to finish the sentence. One example, though very simple, is present in this stalagmite C6, which is dedicated to Senghosret Ang, who was a housekeeper of the palace and dates to the reign of Senghosret III. And as you can see, the surface of the stela is inscribed with 10 lines of text, starting with a classic Hatep-Dinesu formula, and continue with the names of École kinship group. Notably, in the final ninth line, which mentions his Senet Imi, the name extends beyond the carved frame. To accommodate the final hieroglyph of the name, the B1 sign, the line of the frame has been erased in the section and the sign was carved over it. So the frame was not recarved, it leaves this visible space. Another example can be found in the Stela Vienne AS 142, which dates to the 13th dynasty, more or less, and is dedicated to two officials, the scribe of the outer palace, E, and the Irimer Mkhetemet, likely translated as cattle guard. We can discuss this title, please, later on, who was named Ibea. The stela is organized into distinct sections, each of which records the names of different individuals associated with these two officials. However, the absence of explicit filiation within the inscriptions make it impossible to determine with a certainty the exact relationship between all these individuals. So in the second horizontal line of the text, the M17 hieroglyphs in the name of the lady of the house E is once again carved outside the boundary of the frame, and the same phenomenon occurs in the fifth line where the P8 sign in the phrase Majeru, which is included in some of the names, is also extends beyond the carved frame. Furthermore, it is important to note the presence of this incised line of this below the Majeru that divides the section. Also, there is a line that runs all the way the bottom of the stelae, containing a Hatep-Dinesu formula dedicated to Wennefer, who is identified as the chamber keeper of the watchman. The inclusion of this individual in this part of the object raises further questions, notably Wennefer Hatep-Dinesu formula appears at the very bottom of the artifact in a constrained space. If you notice, it's really reach the edge of the objects. It's not like reaching the intended frames. So this position perhaps suggests also that this is an afterthought inclusion on the objects. Such a spatial and stylistic anomalies provides, I think, valuable insights into the evolving nature of the stela creation and the potential dynamics between the individuals commemorating with it. Again, as no affiliations are provided for these people, we cannot be certain about a possible biological relationship, but if we consider the titles, perhaps we can suggest a professional relationship among them, being this last man, this Wennefer, perhaps we'll say have a subordinate position relative to E. If this interpretation is correct, perhaps Wennefer's inclusion in the stela could represent also, as I said, a later addition, perhaps reflecting his, again, rise of status or having a closer relationship, development, a closer personal or professional relationship with E. Also note how, in this case, on the contrary of the one stela that we saw, there are no intention of erasing the frame. They don't care about having the illusion of a continuous line. They just let it. So this practice at the end clearly indicates that the frames were first elements carved on the stela perhaps even without drafting the actual hieroglyphs text that will eventually be inscribed, because if drafts has been made, the artist will have known how much space was required and the frames could have been designed accordingly. This practice, I said, not only sheds light on the sequential production of a stela, but also raises question of whether the manufacture of a stela was the work of one or more individuals, and if they were two, well, how closely the scribe and the artist collaborate, and to what extent did their roles overlap or diverge in the creation of the artifact. So a particularly less common practice in the design of a stela is the inclusion of inscriptions on their sides. And when I say and I refer to this as less common practice, it is important to clarify that I'm specifically discussing the classical rectangular or round top stela, because these ones here, we all know them, they are called nows or semi-now stelae, are commonly inscribed in all their phases, include the sentence, include the scenes, decorative motifs. So this type follow a different set of conventions. So they are outside the scope of this particular analysis. And we can, again, in the discussion time, we can talk about these objects. Okay, so to date, I have identified a very small corpus, and I would love if you know more, please tell me, around 10/11 stelae that feature hieroglyphic inscriptions on their site dating from Middle Kingdom, Second Intermediate Period, specifically late Middle Kingdom since Senghosret III, suggesting that perhaps this practice may have gained prominence during this period and continue during more widely spread during the New Kingdom. So I propose that there are, or I have found from this small corpus, 4 types of edge inscriptions. The first one, not even going to talk about it because it's just images. There are no hieroglyphic inscriptions. This is the only stela that belongs to this type is the stela of Wakasenev. It only, as you can see, features offerings, but this is a very special stela. It also has both sides carved. So very interesting, but let's go for other ones. This is the second type that includes a stela containing, I will call, well-carved formulae, primarily Hetep formula or addressing to the living ones. 4 stelae fall into this category. This is the first one, the stela from Toulouse, 49 to 174. As you can see, this formula have been carefully carved across the ages. There is no clear distinction between the text on the front face and that on the sides. And the functional purpose of these inscriptions as visible and readable messages is evident. For example, this stela of Toulouse, well known because it's one of the Enoch groups, it's parts of one of these Enoch groups, clearly says, all living ones, every Wat priest, every scribe, every lector priest who will see this shepes, if you praise God, you will leave your office to your children. So this emphasis on visibility and readability suggests that such inscriptions were intended to face areas where people will pass by and interact with the text. Consequently, this implied that these stela were not placed straightforward, like front facing, as it is typically, or as we think about the stelae, but it was perhaps positioned laterally to make the inscribed edge the focal point for the viewers. I would say that this is even further supported, this idea, by these 3 stelae, Louvre E2909 A, B, and C, found in Netfu, belonging to the elder of the portal Her A. These stelae were found detached from the mastaba of the Vizier Isi and provide a valuable evidence for their original placement. As you can see, Louvre A and B, they have their front faces carved with the scenes and text, and they have the edges of them with 2 Hetep Dinesu formula for Her A. And then there is the C, the C, Louvre C, which has no inscription, but on the edge, which has a addressing to the living ones. So it has been suggested that it's the upper enclosure, like kind of, I'm trying to put, you have to imagine these 2 ones, A and B, on the sides, and the C as an upper enclosure containing this formula. This position has suggested several authors has made several authors to suggest that they were integral to a larger architectural composition, possible paired with another stela or a statue of Herha placed in the space between them. Interestingly, this stela, I just wanted to say because it was something that, okay. These stela are often referred in literature not as a stela, but as naos or architectural elements. However, the stela of Toulouse, which was likely placed in a similar manner and potentially being part of a comparable configuration, is not described as a naos or an architectural element. It's defined as a stela. So this raises questions about how we classify these objects. If we consider the placement and interaction with other elements, the association between stela and architecture became central to understanding their function. No stela should be analyzed in isolation from its architectural and spatial context, though this is a broader discussion for another talk. So the third group is comprised by two stela, which have carved on the edges names and people whose exact relationship with ego is unknown or can be suggested, but there are no certainty for sure. This group is curiously comprised by the two stela from the second intermediate period. One is this one that belongs to the chief of teams of Upper Egypt, Montuhotep, and the other one belongs to a Chamberlain. I will show you in a minute. So on the side of these two stela, additional individuals are carved. Here we have only the names of these two men inscribed, Medjehu and Montuhotep also, while in the case of this stela, which is British Museum 833 plus label 4560, as you can see here, we have figures, but also the names and the titles of the individuals depicted on the sides. The figures are well carved, the quality of the hieroglyphs inscription matches that on the front faces, and showing no discernible difference in execution. Given the lack of space of this stela, I want you to notice how all the hieroglyphs are kind of matched, they are grouped together on the edges, on the sides. Perhaps these individuals were part of the kinship group that was intended to be displayed on the front group, but there was no space on it. Whether this lack of space resulted from being later additions to the group or just poor planning, during the stela manufactures remains, I would say, impossible to determine. And then quickly, the last group consists of stelae whose aegis features inscriptions referring to known individuals associated with the group, whether it's ego, the person who commissioned the stela, or even possibly the artist who created. This group is comprised by 4 stelae. This is perhaps the more exceptional one from Philadelphia because, again, has the front, the back face, and also the side. There's here the signs on the side are well carved, but then we have other examples. This is the one from the British Museum who has the name of ego at the filiation. We can suggest perhaps that I have suggested that if this stela was later relocated to a side position, someone may have wished to carve at least the essential identifying information. But alternatively, these inscriptions could represent a scribe or an artist notation during the manufacture process, marking the stela subjects for the practical purposes. And in this case, we can see this one, this stela from Vienna, that has the inscription on the edges are not written in hieroglyphs, but cursive hieroglyphs. So a similar explanation could apply to this stela because it names the individual who commissioned the artifact. So perhaps it was a mark, a note for the artist, but of course it is also plausible that this was a deliberated way for the commissioner to assert their presence and significance in the monument. Then perhaps these inscriptions were not intended to face the audience, but instead serve as symbolical purpose, the mere exist conveying meaning. And in the same way, sorry, but I was not able to find a good photo for this stela. We have the British Museum EA 774, which includes a depiction of the sculpture of the stela, probably, could reflect perhaps an artistic license, as the inscription naming him appears on the front face. So again, this traces the possibility that such inscriptions were not intended to be the focal point of the objects or even meant to be seen at all. Instead, they might have served a subtle role existing outside the primary visual or narrative as focus on the stela. So as final comments, really quickly, just please be aware on the diversity in stelae design and inscriptions practice, because I think highlights the diverse purposes and their complexity in the production. Then we need to take into account the importance of spatial considerations in stelae production and his technical relationship with architecture, because it reflects the technical challenge of carving and their integration in the general architecture. Consider that I would say that many science inscriptions were continuations of previous inscriptions that lack sufficient space. And then there is a diverse type of edge inscriptions. Some of there, I would say that there are no doubts that they were designed to be directly seen by the audience, while others may have served different purposes beyond visibility, such as practical additions, symbolic assertions of individuals present, or even artistic flourishes. And thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you very much. It was really interesting presentation. Of course, not only for this paper, but also for the one that we have, those that we have listened and attended before. We'll discuss these after our lunch break. I would like now to welcome our last speaker for the second part of today's panel, Roxana Flamini. She's an independent researcher at CONICET, a professor at the National University of Louvain, and a member of the Ibero-American Network of Researchers in the Ancient Near East, based at the University of Alcalá. She currently leads the program for the study of pre-modern societies at the Research Institute of the Faculty of Social Sciences at the Catholic University of Argentina, and she has led the doctoral programs and research institutes, as well as academic journals and series specializing in the field in Argentina, Spain, and the United States. Among her many publications might be mentioned the edited volume Interrelaciones e Identidades Culturales en el Cercano Oriente Antiguo, and contributions such as Insights for Eternity, the Graffiti on the Second Stela of Camose Revised, published in 2021, and Elite Emulation and Patronage Relationship in the Middle Bronze, the Egyptianized Dynasty of Byblos. So welcome, and I leave you the floor.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you to all of you for being here. Thank you, Carlos and Gigi, for inviting me to participate of this amazing conference. And I'm going to read because time is gold. And I guess that everyone is hungry. Okay. Yeah. Okay, I'm also grateful to other people, Jérémy Jourdain from the Saint Franco-Égyptien, the Études de Temple de Karnak in Egypt, for providing high-quality photograph of this monument, and to Ronald Leprechaun and Diego Espinel for engaging in valuable discussions on various aspects of this topic with me. So, as you know, okay, oh, sorry, because there are the codes and there is no the transliteration time. Things happens, okay. Well, okay. As you know, Chamos was the last king of the 17th dynasty ruling from Thebes. He reigned near the end of the second intermediate period around 1550 BC and led campaigns against the Hyksos and the Nubian rulers. Royal names are challenging to translate into modern languages. Therefore, in several instances, I follow the translations provided by Leprechaun, and in others, his suggested approach to translating these names. The full titulary of Chamos is preserved only in the Carnarvon tablet, a copy of the first stela of Chamos, which is now reduced to 2 fragments, and which preserves only the Horus name of the king, as you can see there in this slide. The names preserved in the Carnarvon tablet written in hieratic include the Horus name 1 of the king, Ha-Her-Neset-F, the one who has appeared on his throne, the Nepti name Wehem-Menu, traditionally translated as the one who has repeated monuments, but I'll return to this translation later. The golden Horus name Seher-Chawi, the one who has pleased the 2 lands. The dual king name Wach-Heper-Ra, the flourishing one is the manifestation of Ra, and the son of Ra name Kames-Nechet, Chamos the strong or the victorious. The remaining evidence preserves different names of the king alternately. The block at Karnak preserves only the Horus, 2 ladies, and son of Ra names of this king. These are different sources where the names are preserved, and as you can see, they come from different contexts and vary in type. We have a writing board, stelas, weapons, plaque, a handle of a fan. As I mentioned before, the Horus name 1 preserved in the Carnarvon tablet and the first stela can be translated as the one who has appeared on his throne following Leprechaun. The Horus name 2 of the king is preserved on the handle of a fan found in the assemblage of Queen Ahotep, which was probably buried in the king's tomb and later moved to this secondary location. The object and the context are completely different from the stelas. A fan is a ceremonial object related to the breath of life. The proposed translation of the name written in the Serech is the one who has provisioned the 2 lands. The depiction shows the king presenting an offering of bread to the god Khonsu. Khonsu's name is inscribed to the right of the king's dual king name, enclosed within a royal cartouche, the Necher Nefer Wach-Heperra Diang, the perfect God, Wach-Heperra, given eternal life. This presentation focuses on a block displayed at the Open Air Museum at Karnak, which has received relatively little attention over the years. To my knowledge, the block was first mentioned by Raymond Gael about an incoming article by Henri Gautier, who provided the most detailed study of this monument in a 1932 publication. Additional brief references appear in 1971 by Björkman in Kings at Karnak, and in 1972 by Labib Habashi in his book on the second stela of Chamos, and for Kim Riholt in his book on the second intermediate period. But these are only references. The block was probably cut from a lintel to build a stand. Later, 4 steps were added to the monument. Gautier, who studied the block likely from a photograph, proposed that it was a stand for a statue, while Habashi suggested it was a stand for an house. Anyway, it is a stand. And as you can see, the left side of the monument is completely erased, it's destroyed, unfortunately. But on the contrary, the right side is better preserved, showing the sonora name of the king, Kamos, and an epithet related to the god Amun-Ra. I'll return to this later. Let's go to the front. On the front, an Ankh, a sign that can be read from both sides, serves as the focal point from which the two mirroring titularies depart, extending to both flanking sides. The construction is a prospective sechemef, literally meaning "May the Horus," name of the king, live, similar to the Spanish "Viva el Rey" or the French "Vive le Roi." I translated it as "Long live the Horus Nefer-Hab Tawi," and this Horus name is not attested elsewhere. The word Hab in this instance includes the determinative N11, the crescent moon symbol. Typically, this sign serves as a logogram for moon or as a determinative related to various types of measures, such as time in month and of length in palm. However, attributing these meanings to Hab in this specific context proves challenging. Gautier translated the Horus name as the good living Horus who bends the two lands, implying that Kamos brought the two halves of Egypt under his dominion. However, he did not further substantiate this interpretation. Probably, he opted for this translation because in the Wörterbuch, Hab is assimilated to bow in a reverence, to the idea of bow in a reverence, or to bend the arms as a gesture of reverence, but also to have to be crooked. But also the word Hab also means neck, as well as the other writing of Hab. So you can see that it's really challenging, this translation. But last but not least, the word Hab can also refer to the human clavicle, the collarbone, which sometimes appears with both the moon determinative and the flesh or part of the body sign. Due to the clavicle's curved sickle-like shape, Breasted suggested long ago that the spellings of these two terms may be visually connected. Precisely, Le Breton provided, sorry because there is no the reading of the transliteration, because we have now the translation times font. But anyway, Le Breton provided a different rendering of the name, despite quoting the meaning suggested by Gautier in a footnote, considering the translation of Hab as sickle, the perfect one who is the sickle of the two lands. Nevertheless, this specific writing of the word Hab raises an intriguing hypothesis. Perhaps the name blends both meanings, the sickle and the action of bending, as proposed by Gautier, conveying the idea of the sickle that has bent the two lands, or the perfect one who has bent by force the two lands, a king who subdued his enemies in war. The idea of uniting or joining the two lands is not present here. Other rulers like Mentuhotep II of the 11th dynasty or Sobek-Hotep of the 13th dynasty used the term Sematawi for this assertion. Instead, Kamos opted for a word not attested in other titularies. Besides, Camos's Horus names reveal an anomaly because he changed this name at least 3 times during his short reign, estimated to have lasted between 3 and 5 years. Another hypothesis that could be considered is that the king used different Horus names depending on the context. A risky hypothesis, but. So let's return to Gautier's article to explore the Nepti name, Wehen-Menu. He translated it as repeating the monuments, but as you can see, he added an N in the hieroglyphs, which he didn't translate. He likely inferred it from shadows in the photograph he used to study the monument. Let's see what's happened with this stela, the third stela of Camos. It is in extremely poor condition, but preserves the Nepti name of the king as Wehen-Menu, followed by a preposition, specifically indicating location, an M. Wehen-Menu were in Thebes, in Karnak, who knows? But in this high-quality photograph of the block, we can see that after Wehen-Menu, there is an N25 sign, the sign for foreign lands or hill countries, with plural strokes, likely preceded by a preposition. I reconstructed her Eve, as it is not an M, and a similar construction appears in the tale of Sinué. Additionally, a recent article by Anya Coates provides an in-depth study of the term Wehem, suggesting it could signify the restoration or reactivation of monuments that had suffered destruction. In the Carnarvon tablet, Camos mentioned that the Hyksos subordinated several Egyptian local rulers and their cities, turning them into a nest of Asiatics like Neferusi. A similar concept is evident in the second stela. Furthermore, Avaris, in the second stela, is marked with the N25 determinative, indicating it as a foreign land. Thus, I propose to read this name as Two Ladies, the one who has reactivated restored monuments in the middle of the foreign lands. Let's go to the right side of the block. It preserves a partial rendering of Camos's titulary, featuring several challenging aspects. It includes many empty spaces with no evidence of intervention of the surface except for polishing. The monument appears to have been left unfinished. The process for preparing surfaces and carving hieroglyphs is well documented. After polishing, teams of artisans would begin work. Apprentices learn from more experienced workers, carving simpler signs, while more complex signs, such as human figures, were left to master artisans. John Baines wrote a lot about this topic. And this seems to be the case with this monument. The empty spaces were likely intended to be filled with human figures. Evidence shows that Camos's nomen was typically followed by the ideogram 824, which symbolizes the king's strength and victorious qualities. Thus, it is possible that the missing sign was that one. Regarding a possible determinative for Amun-Ra, a likely candidate is the common symbol for God, A40, which is also an anthropomorphic figure. Additionally, Camos's name might have been tentatively preceded by the title Son of Ra. The Duk sign, another challenging sign to carve, may have also been considered. Thus, this is probably the work of an apprentice, a junior artisan. So, sorry again, this is the transliteration and translation that I proposed for the inscription on this block. Long live the Horus, Neferhab Chawi, the perfect one, who is the sickle that has bent the two lands. Two ladies, Wahem Menu Harib Hasut, the one who has reactivated restored monuments in the middle of the foreign lands. Son of Ra, Kamos the strong, the victorious, given eternal life, beloved of Hamun-Ra, Lord of the thrones of the two lands. So, for finishing, these are the sum up. The block contains a new Horus name for the king Kamos, probably referring to his military skills not attested elsewhere. It also provides a composite Nepti name, which likely refers to the restoration of monuments in locations previously under the control of foreign rulers. The right side of the monument preserves the son of Ra name of the king, followed by an epithet referring to Amun-Ra. Several signs were not written, probably because the monument was left unfinished, but also gives clues about how artisans worked. And a final question, why the monument was left unfinished. It is a hard question to answer, but the king could have died in the meantime, and then the monument was abandoned. Nevertheless, it is relevant to mention that the titulary of the king refers to his achievements against the foreign rulers who dominated part of Egypt at that time. Kamos's reign appears to have been a disruptive one. He commissioned at least 3 stelae to be placed at Karnak. The best preserved of these, the second stela, begins mid-sentence. We suppose that there is a first part, but we don't know where it is. Kamos changed his Horus name 3 times during his short reign, as well as his son of Ra name, alternating between Kamos and the epithet, this great Heka, a title strongly related to his military skills. His Nepti name seems to be a composite one with variation. In the third stela, it is followed by the preposition M, while in the Karnak block, it likely reads her ib instead of M. So the final phase of the second intermediate period was undoubtedly a complex and turbulent time in Thebes. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much. And so after this wonderful presentation, we will stop for our lunch break, which will end around, so we will reconvene at 3:15. Yes, or 20, or 20, yes. Just to give a little bit more time to the people, to the participants to eat something. And yes, and I will also write on Zoom just to be sure that also the online participants are known. Okay, thank you very much. See you later.